Chapter 13 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 13. The Ferryman's House. Paul Delroze did not speak a word. Pushing his prisoner in front of him, after tying the major's wrists behind his back, he returned to the bridge of boats in the darkness illumined by brief flashes of light. The fighting continued, but a certain number of the enemy tried to run away, and when the volunteers who guarded the bridge received them with a volley of fire, the Germans thought that they had been cut off, and this diversion hastened their defeat. When Paul arrived, the combat was over, but the enemy was bound, sooner or later, to deliver a counter-attack supported by the reinforcements that had been promised to the commandant, and the defense was prepared forthwith. The ferryman's house, which had been strongly fortified by the Germans and surrounded with trenches, consisted of a ground floor and an upper story of 3 rooms, now knocked into one. At the back of this large room, however, was a recess with a sloping roof, reached by 3 steps, which at one time had done duty as a servant's attic. Paul, who was entrusted with the arrangement of this upper floor, brought his prisoner here. He laid him on the floor, bound him with a cord and fastened him to a beam, and while doing so, he was seized with such a paroxysm of hatred that he took him by the throat as though to strangle him. He mastered himself, however. After all, there was no hurry. Before killing the man or handing him over to the soldiers to be shot against the wall, why deny himself the supreme satisfaction of having an explanation with him? When the lieutenant entered, Paul said, so as to be heard by all, and especially by the major, "I recommend that scoundrel to your care, Lieutenant. It's Major Hermann, one of the chief spies in the German army. I have the proofs on me. Remember that, in case anything happens to me. And if we should have to retreat—" The lieutenant smiled. "There's no question of that. We shall not retreat, for the very good reason that I would rather blow up the shanty first. And Major Hermann, therefore, would be blown up with us. So make your mind easy." The 2 officers discussed the defensive measures to be adopted, and the men quickly got to work. First of all, the bridge of boats was unmade, trenches dug along the canal, and the machine guns turned to face the other way. Paul, on his first floor, had the sandbags moved from the one side of the house to the other, and the less solid-looking portions of the wall shored up with beams. At 5:30, under the rays of the German flashlights, several shells fell round about. One of them struck the house. The big guns began to sweep the towpath. A few minutes before daybreak, a detachment of cyclists arrived by this path, with Bernard d'Andeville at their head. He explained that 2 companies and a section of sappers in advance of a complete battalion had started, but their progress was hampered by the enemy's shells, and they were obliged to skirt the marshes under the cover of the dike supporting the towpath. This had slowed their march, and it would be an hour before they could arrive. "An hour," said the lieutenant. "It will be stiff work. Still, we can do it. So—" While he was giving new orders and placing the cyclists at their posts, Paul came up, and he was just going to tell Bernard of Major Hermann's capture when his brother-in-law announced his news. "I say, Paul, Dad's with me." Paul gave a start. "Your father is here? Your father came with you?" "Just so, and in the most natural manner. You must know that he had been looking for an opportunity for some time. By the way, he has been promoted to interpreter lieutenant." Paul was no longer listening. He merely said to himself, "Monsieur d'Andeville is here. Monsieur d'Andeville, the Comtesse Hermine's husband. He must know, surely. Is she alive or dead? Or has he been the dupe of a scheming woman to the end, and does he still bear a loving recollection of one who has vanished from his life? But no, that's incredible, because there is that photograph taken 4 years later and sent to him from Berlin. So he knows. And then—" Paul was greatly perplexed. The revelations made by Karl the spy had suddenly revealed Monsieur d'Andeville in a startling light. And now circumstances were bringing Monsieur d'Andeville into Paul's presence, at the very time when Major Hermann had been captured. Paul turned towards the attic. The major was lying motionless with his face against the wall. "Your father has remained outside?" Paul asked his brother-in-law. "Yes, he took the bicycle of a man who was riding near us and who was slightly wounded. Papa is seeing to him." "Go and fetch him. And if the lieutenant doesn't object—" He was interrupted by the bursting of a shrapnel shell, the bullets of which riddled the sandbags heaped up in front of them. The day was breaking. They could see an enemy column looming out of the darkness a mile away at most. "Ready there!" shouted the lieutenant from below. "Don't fire a shot till I give the order. No one to show himself." It was not until a quarter of an hour later, and then only for 4 or 5 minutes, that Paul and Monsieur d'Andeville were able to exchange a few words. Their conversation, moreover, was so greatly hurried that Paul had no time to decide what attitude he should take up in the presence of Élisabeth's father. The tragedy of the past, the part which the Comtesse Hermine's husband played in that tragedy, all this was mingled in his mind with the defense of the blockhouse, and in spite of their great liking for each other, their greeting was somewhat absent and distracted. Paul was ordering a small window to be stopped with a mattress. Bernard was posted at the other end of the room. Monsieur d'Andeville said to Paul: "You're sure of holding out, aren't you?" "Absolutely, as we've got to." "Yes, you've got to. I was with the division yesterday, with the English general to whom I am attached as interpreter, when the attack was decided on. The position seems to be of essential importance, and it is indispensable that we should stick to it. I saw that this gave me an opportunity of seeing you, Paul, as I knew that your regiment was to be here. So I asked leave to accompany the contingent that had been ordered to—" There was a fresh interruption. A shell came through the roof and shattered the wall on the side opposite to the canal. "Any one hurt?" "No, sir." Monsieur d'Andeville went on: "The strangest part of it was finding Bernard at your colonel's last night. You can imagine how glad I was to join the cyclists. It was my only chance of seeing something of my boy and of shaking you by the hand. And then I had no news of my poor Élisabeth, and Bernard told me—" "Ah," said Paul quickly, "has Bernard told you all that happened at the château?" "At least as much as he knew. But there are a good many things that are difficult to understand, and Bernard says that you have more precise details. For instance, why did Élisabeth stay at the château?" "Because she wanted to," said Paul. "I was not told of her decision until later, by letter." "I know, but why didn't you take her with you, Paul?" "When I left Ornequin, I made all the necessary arrangements for her to go." "Good. But you ought not to have left Ornequin without her. All the trouble is due to that." Monsieur d'Andeville had been speaking with a certain acerbity, and, as Paul did not answer, he asked again: "Why didn't you take Élisabeth away? Bernard said that there was something very serious, that you spoke of exceptional circumstances. Perhaps you won't mind explaining?" Paul seemed to suspect a latent hostility in Monsieur d'Andeville, and this irritated him all the more on the part of a man whose conduct now appeared to him so perplexing. "Do you think," he said, "that this is quite the moment?" "Yes, yes, yes! We may be separated any minute." Paul did not allow him to finish. He turned abruptly towards his father-in-law and exclaimed: "You are right, sir. It's a horrible idea. It would be terrible if I were not able to reply to your questions or you to mine. Élisabeth's fate perhaps depends on the few words which we are about to speak. For we must know the truth between us. A single word may bring it to light, and there is no time to be lost. We must speak out now, whatever happens." His excitement surprised Monsieur d'Andeville, who asked: "Wouldn't it be as well to call Bernard over?" "No, no," said Paul, "on no account. It's a thing that he mustn't know about, because it concerns—" "Because it concerns whom?" asked Monsieur d'Andeville, who was more and more astonished. A man standing near them was hit by a bullet and fell. Paul rushed to his assistance, but the man had been shot through the forehead and was dead. 2 more bullets entered through an opening which was wider than it need be, and Paul ordered it to be partly closed up. Monsieur d'Andeville, who had been helping him, pursued the conversation. "You were saying that Bernard must not hear because it concerns—" "His mother," Paul replied. "His mother? What do you mean? His mother? It concerns my wife? I don't understand." Through the loopholes in the wall they could see 3 enemy columns advancing, above the flooded fields, moving forward on narrow causeways which converged towards the canal opposite the ferryman's house. "We shall fire when they are 200 yards from the canal," said the lieutenant commanding the volunteers, who had come to inspect the defences. "If only their guns don't knock the shanty about too much." "Where are our reinforcements?" asked Paul. "They'll be here in 30 or 40 minutes. Meantime the 75's are doing good work." The shells were flying through space in both directions, some falling in the midst of the German columns, others around the blockhouse. Paul ran to every side, encouraging and directing his men. From time to time he went to the attic and looked at Major Hermann, who lay perfectly still. Then Paul returned to his post. He did not for a second cease to think of the duty incumbent on him as an officer and a combatant, nor for a second of what he had to say to Monsieur d'Andeville. But these two mingled obsessions deprived him of all lucidity of mind, and he did not know how to come to an explanation with his father-in-law, or how to unravel the tangled position. Monsieur d'Andeville asked his questions several times. He did not reply. The lieutenant's voice was raised. "Attention! Present! Fire!" The command was repeated 4 times over. The nearest enemy column, decimated by the bullets, seemed to waver, but the others came up with it, and it formed up again. 2 German shells burst against the house. The roof was carried away bodily. Several feet of the frontage were demolished and 3 men killed. After the storm, a calm. But Paul had so clear a sense of the danger which threatened them all that he was unable to contain himself any longer. Suddenly making up his mind, addressing Monsieur d'Andeville without further preamble, he said: "One word in particular. I must know. Are you quite sure that the Comtesse d'Andeville is dead?" And without waiting for the reply, he went on: "Yes, you think my question mad. It seems so to you because you do not know. But I am not mad, and I ask you to answer my question as you would do if I had the time to state the reasons that justify me in asking it. Is the Comtesse Hermine dead?" Monsieur d'Andeville, restraining his feelings and consenting to adopt the hypothesis which Paul seemed to insist on, said: "Is there any reason that allows you to presume that my wife is still alive?" "There are very serious reasons, I might say incontestable reasons." Monsieur d'Andeville shrugged his shoulders and said in a firm voice: "My wife died in my arms. My lips touched her icy hands, felt that chill of death which is so horrible in those we love. I myself dressed her, as she had asked, in her wedding gown, and I was there when they nailed down the coffin. Anything else?" Paul listened to him and thought to himself: "Has he spoken the truth? Yes, he has. And still, how can I admit—" Speaking more imperiously, Monsieur d'Andeville repeated: "Anything else?" "Yes," said Paul. "One more question. There was a portrait in the Comtesse d'Andeville's boudoir. Was that her portrait?" "Certainly, her full-length portrait." "Showing her with a black lace scarf over her shoulders?" "Yes, the kind of scarf she liked wearing." "And the scarf was fastened in front by a cameo set in a gold snake?" "Yes, it was an old cameo which belonged to my mother and which my wife always wore." Paul yielded to thoughtless impulse. Monsieur d'Andeville's assertion seemed to him so many admissions, and trembling with rage, he rapped out: "Monsieur, you have not forgotten, have you, that my father was murdered? We often spoke of it, you and I. He was your friend. Well, the woman who murdered him and whom I saw, the woman whose image has stamped itself on my brain, wore a black lace scarf round her shoulders and a cameo set in a gold snake. And I found this woman's portrait in your wife's room. Yes, I saw her portrait on my wedding evening. Do you understand now? Do you understand, or don't you?" It was a tragic moment between the two men. Monsieur d'Andeville stood trembling, with his hands clutching his rifle. Why is he trembling? Paul asked himself, and his suspicions increased until they became an actual accusation. Is it a feeling of protest, or his rage at being unmasked, that makes him shake like that? And am I to look upon him as his wife's accomplice? For after all... He felt a fierce grip twisting his arm. Monsieur d'Andeville, grey in the face, blurted out: How dare you? How dare you suggest that my wife murdered your father? Why, you must be drunk. My wife, a saint in the sight of God and man? And you dare! Oh, I don't know what keeps me from smashing your face in." Paul released himself roughly. The two men, shaking with a rage which was increased by the din of the firing and the madness of their quarrel, were on the verge of coming to blows while the shells and bullets whistled all around them. Then a new strip of wall fell to pieces. Paul gave his orders and, at the same time, thought of Major Hermann lying in his corner, to whom he could have brought Monsieur d'Andeville like a criminal who is confronted with his accomplice. But why then did he not do so? Suddenly remembering the photograph of the Comtesse Hermine which he had found on Rosenthal's body, he took it from his pocket and thrust it in front of Monsieur d'Andeville's eyes. "And this?" he shouted. "Do you know what this is? There's a date on it, 1902, and you pretend that the Comtesse Hermine is dead. Answer me, can't you? A photograph taken in Berlin and sent to you by your wife 4 years after her death." Monsieur d'Andeville staggered. It was as though all his rage had evaporated and was changing into infinite stupefaction. Paul brandished before his face the overwhelming proof constituted by that bit of cardboard. And he heard Monsieur d'Andeville mutter, "Who can have stolen it from me? It was among my papers in Paris. Why didn't I tear it up?" Then he added in a very low whisper, "Oh, Hermine, Hermine, my adored one." Surely it was an avowal. But if so, what was the meaning of an avowal expressed in those terms and with that declaration of love for a woman laden with crime and infamy? The lieutenant shouted from the ground floor, "Everybody into the trenches except 10 men. Delroze, keep the best shots and order independent firing." The volunteers, headed by Bernard, hurried downstairs. The enemy was approaching the canal in spite of the losses which he had sustained. In fact, on the right and left, knots of pioneers, constantly renewed, were already striving with might and main to collect the boats stranded on the bank. The lieutenant in command of the volunteers formed his men into a first line of defense against the imminent assault, while the sharpshooters in the house had orders to kill without ceasing under the storm of shells. One by one, 5 of these marksmen fell. Paul and Monsieur d'Andeville were here, there, and everywhere, while consulting one another as to the commands to be given and the things to be done. There was not the least chance, in view of their great inferiority in numbers, that they would be able to resist. But there was some hope of their holding out until the arrival of the reinforcements, which would ensure the possession of the blockhouse. The French artillery, finding it impossible to secure an effective aim amid the confusion of the combatants, had ceased fire, whereas the German guns were still bombarding the house, and the shells were bursting at every moment. Yet another man was wounded. He was carried into the attic and laid beside Major Hermann, where he died almost immediately. Outside there was fighting on and even in the water of the canal, in the boats and around them. There were hand-to-hand contests amid general uproar, yells of execration and pain, cries of terror and shouts of victory. The confusion was so great that Paul and Monsieur d'Andeville found it difficult to take aim. Paul said to his father-in-law, "I'm afraid we may be done for before assistance arrives. I am bound, therefore, to warn you that the lieutenant has made his arrangements to blow up the house. As you are here by accident, without any authorization that gives you the quality or duties of a combatant—" "I am here as a Frenchman," said Monsieur d'Andeville, "and I shall stay on to the end." "Then perhaps we shall have time to finish what we have to say, sir. Listen to me. I will be as brief as I can, but if you should see the least glimmer of light, please do not hesitate to interrupt me." He fully understood that there was a gulf of darkness between them, and that whether guilty or not, whether his wife's accomplice or her dupe, Monsieur d'Andeville must know things which he, Paul, did not know, and that these things could only be made plain by an adequate recital of what had happened. He therefore began to speak. He spoke calmly and deliberately, while Monsieur d'Andeville listened in silence. And they never ceased firing, quietly loading, aiming and reloading, as though they were at practice. All around and above them death pursued its implacable work. Paul had hardly described his arrival at Ornequin with Elizabeth, their entrance into the locked room, and his dismay at the sight of the portrait, when an enormous shell exploded over their heads, spattering them with shrapnel bullets. The 4 volunteers were hit. Paul also fell, wounded in the neck, and though he suffered no pain, he felt that all his ideas were gradually fading into a mist without his being able to retain them. He made an effort, however, and by some miracle of will was still able to exercise a remnant of energy that allowed him to keep his hold on certain reflections and impressions. Thus he saw his father-in-law kneeling beside him, and succeeded in saying to him, "Elizabeth's diary. You'll find it in my kit bag in camp, with a few pages written by myself, which will explain. But first you must... Look, that German officer over there, bound up. He's a spy. Keep an eye on him. Kill him. If not, on the 10th of January... But you will kill him, won't you?" Paul could speak no more. Besides, he saw that Monsieur d'Andeville was not kneeling down to listen to him or help him, but that, himself shot, with his face bathed in blood, he was bending double and finally fell in a huddled heap, uttering moans that grew fainter and fainter. A great calm now descended on the big room, while the rifles crackled outside. The German guns were no longer firing. The enemy's counterattack must be meeting with success, and Paul, incapable of moving, lay awaiting the terrible explosion foretold by the lieutenant. He pronounced Elizabeth's name time after time. He reflected that no danger threatened her now, because Major Hermann was also about to die. Besides, her brother Bernard would know how to defend her. But after a while this sort of tranquillity disappeared, changed into uneasiness and then into restless anxiety, giving way to a feeling of which every second that passed increased the torture. He could not tell whether he was haunted by a nightmare, by some morbid hallucination. It all happened on the side of the attic to which he had dragged Major Hermann. A soldier's dead body was lying between them, and it seemed to his horror as if the major had cut his bonds and were rising to his feet and looking around him. Paul exerted all his strength to open his eyes and keep them open, but an ever thicker shadow veiled them, and through this shadow he perceived, as one sees a confused sight in the darkness, the major taking off his cloak, stooping over the body, removing its blue coat and buttoning it on himself. Then he put the dead man's cap on his head, fastened his scarf round his neck, took the soldier's rifle, bayonet and cartridges, and thus transfigured, stepped down the 3 wooden stairs. It was a terrible vision. Paul would have been glad to doubt his eyes, to believe in some phantom image born of his fever and delirium. But everything confirmed the reality of what he saw, and it meant to him the most infernal suffering. The major was making his escape. Paul was too weak to contemplate the position in all its bearings. Was the major thinking of killing him and of killing Monsieur d'Andeville? Did the major know that they were there, both of them wounded, within reach of his hand? Paul never asked himself these questions. One idea alone obsessed his failing mind. Major Hermann was escaping. Thanks to his uniform, he would mingle with the volunteers. By the aid of some signal, he would get back to the Germans, and he would be free, and he would resume his work of persecution, his deadly work against Elizabeth. Oh, if the explosion had only taken place! If the ferryman's house could but be blown up and the major with it! Paul still clung to this hope in his half-conscious condition. Meanwhile his reason was wavering, his thoughts became more and more confused, and he swiftly sank into that darkness in which one neither sees nor hears. 3 weeks later, the general commanding-in-chief stepped from his motor car in front of an old château in the Bourbonnais, now transformed into a military hospital. The officer in charge was waiting for him at the door. "Does Second Lieutenant Delroze know that I am coming to see him?" "Yes, sir." "Take me to his room." Paul Delroze was sitting up. His neck was bandaged, but his features were calm and showed no traces of fatigue. Much moved by the presence of the great chief whose energy and coolness had saved France, he rose to the salute, but the general gave him his hand and exclaimed in a kind and affectionate voice: "Sit down, Lieutenant Delroze. I say lieutenant, for you were promoted yesterday. No, no thanks. By Jove, we are still your debtors. So you're up and about?" "Why, yes, sir, the wound wasn't much." "So much the better. I'm satisfied with all my officers, but for all that we don't find fellows like you by the dozen. Your colonel has sent in a special report about you, which sets forth such an array of acts of incomparable bravery that I have half a mind to break my own rule and to make the report public." "No, please don't, sir." "You are right, Delroze. It is the first attribute of heroism that it likes to remain anonymous, and it is France alone that must have all the glory for the time being. So I shall be content for the present to mention you once more in the orders of the day and to hand you the cross for which you were already recommended." "I don't know how to thank you, sir." "In addition, my dear fellow, if there's the least thing you want, I insist that you should give me this opportunity of doing it for you." Paul nodded his head and smiled. All this cordial kindness and attentiveness were putting him at his ease. "But suppose I want too much, sir?" "Go ahead." "Very well, sir, I accept. And what I ask is this: first of all, a fortnight's sick leave counting from Saturday the 9th of January, the day on which I shall be leaving the hospital." "That's not a favor, that's a right." "I know, sir, but I must have the right to spend my leave where I please." "Very well." "And more than that, I must have in my pocket a permit written in your own hand, sir, which will give me every latitude to move about as I wish in the French lines and to call for any assistance that can be of use to me." The general looked at Paul for a moment and said: "That's a serious request you're making, Delroze." "Yes, sir, I know it is. But the thing I want to undertake is serious too." "All right, I agree. Anything more?" "Yes, sir. Sergeant Bernard d'Andeville, my brother-in-law, took part as I did in the action at the ferryman's house. He was wounded like myself and brought to the same hospital, from which he will probably be discharged at the same time. I should like him to have the same leave and to receive permission to accompany me." "I agree. Anything more?" "Bernard's father, Comte Stéphane d'Andeville, second lieutenant interpreter attached to the British Army, was also wounded on that day by my side. I have learnt that his wound, though serious, is not likely to prove fatal and that he has been moved to an English hospital, I don't know which. I would ask you to send for him as soon as he is well and to keep him on your staff until I come to you and report on the task which I have taken in hand." "Very well. Is that all?" "Very nearly, sir. It only remains for me to thank you for your kindness by asking you to give me a list of 20 French prisoners now in Germany in whom you take a special interest. Those 20 prisoners will be free in a fortnight from now at most." "Eh? What's that?" For all his coolness, the general seemed a little taken aback. He echoed: "Free in a fortnight from now? 20 prisoners?" "I give you my promise, sir." "Don't talk nonsense." "It shall be as I say." "Whatever the prisoners' rank? Whatever their social position?" "Yes, sir." "And by regular means, means that can be avowed?" "By means to which there can be no possible objection." The general looked at Paul again with the eye of a leader who is in the habit of judging men and reckoning them at their true value. He knew that the man before him was not a boaster, but a man of action and a man of his word, who went straight ahead and kept his promises. He replied: "Very well, Delroze, you shall have your list tomorrow." Chapter 14. Chapter 14 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 14. A Masterpiece of Kultur. On the morning of Sunday, the 10th of January, Lieutenant Delroze and Sergeant d'Andeville stepped on to the platform at Corvigny, went to call on the commandant of the town, and then took a carriage in which they drove to the Château d'Ornequin. "All the same," said Bernard, stretching out his legs in the fly, "I never thought that things would turn out as they have done when I was hit by a splinter of shrapnel between the Yser and the ferryman's house. What a hot corner it was just then! Believe me or believe me not, Paul, if our reinforcements hadn't come up we should have been done for in another 5 minutes. We were jolly lucky." "We were indeed," said Paul. "I felt that next day when I woke up in a French ambulance." "What I can't get over, though," Bernard continued, "is the way that blackguard of a Major Hermann made off. So you took him prisoner, and then you saw him unfasten his bonds and escape? The cheek of the rascal! You may be sure he got away safe and sound." Paul muttered, "I haven't a doubt of it. And I don't doubt either that he means to carry out his threats against Élisabeth." "Bosh! We have 48 hours before us, as he gave his pal Karl the 10th of January as the date of his arrival, and he won't act until 2 days later." "And suppose he acts to day?" said Paul in a husky voice. Notwithstanding his anguish, however, the drive did not seem long to him. He was at last approaching, and this time really, the object from which each day of the last 4 months had removed him to a greater distance. Ornequin was on the frontier, and Èbrecourt was but a few minutes from the frontier. He refused to think of the obstacles which would intervene before he could reach Èbrecourt, discover his wife's retreat, and save her. He was alive. Élisabeth was alive. No obstacles existed between him and her. The Château d'Ornequin, or rather what remained of it, for even the ruins of the château had been subjected to a fresh bombardment in November, was serving as a cantonment for territorial troops whose first line of trenches skirted the frontier. There was not much fighting on this side because, for tactical reasons, it was not to the enemy's advantage to push too far forward. The defences were of equal strength, and a very active watch was kept on either side. These were the particulars which Paul obtained from the territorial lieutenant with whom he lunched. "My dear fellow," concluded the officer after Paul had told him of the object of his journey, "I am altogether at your service. But if it's a question of getting from Ornequin to Èbrecourt, you can make up your mind that you won't do it." "I shall do it all right." "It'll have to be through the air then," said the officer with a laugh. "No." "Or underground." "Perhaps." "There you're wrong. We wanted ourselves to do some sapping and mining. It was no use. We're on a deposit of rock in which it's impossible to dig." It was Paul's turn to smile. "My dear chap, if you'll just be kind enough to lend me for 1 hour 4 strong men armed with picks and shovels, I shall be at Èbrecourt to night." "I say, 4 men to dig a 6-mile tunnel through the rock in an hour?" "That's ample. Also, you must promise absolute secrecy both as to the means employed and the rather curious discoveries to which they are bound to lead. I shall make a report to the General Commanding in Chief, but no one else is to know." "Very well, I'll select my 4 fellows for you myself. Where am I to bring them to you?" "On the terrace near the donjon." This terrace commands the Liseron from a height of some 150 feet, and in consequence of a loop in the river, is exactly opposite Corvigny, whose steeple and the neighboring hills are seen in the distance. Of the castle keep, nothing remains but its enormous base, which is continued by the foundation walls mingled with natural rocks, which support the terrace. A garden extends its clumps of laurels and spindle trees to the parapet. It was here that Paul went. Time after time he strode up and down the esplanade, leaning over the river and inspecting the blocks that had fallen from the keep under the mantle of ivy. "Now then," said the lieutenant on arriving with his men, "is this your starting point? I warn you we are standing with our backs to the frontier." "Pooh," replied Paul in the same jesting tone. "All roads lead to Berlin." He pointed to a circle which he had marked out with stakes and set the men to work. "Go ahead, my lads." They began to throw up, within a circle of 3 yards in circumference, a soil consisting of vegetable mould in which, in 20 minutes' time, they had dug a hole 5 feet deep. Here they came upon a layer of stone cemented together, and their work now became much more difficult, for the cement was of incredible hardness, and they were only to break it up by inserting their picks into the cracks. Paul followed the operations with anxious attention. After an hour he told them to stop. He himself went down into the hole and then went on digging, but slowly, as though examining the effect of every blow that he struck. "That's it," he said, drawing himself up. "What?" asked Bernard. "The ground on which we are standing is only a floor of the big buildings that used to adjoin the old keep, buildings which were razed to the ground centuries ago, and on the top of which this garden was laid out." "Well?" "Well, in clearing away the soil, I have broken through the ceiling of one of the old rooms. Look." He took a stone, placed it right in the centre of the narrower opening which he himself had made, and let it drop. The stone disappeared. A dull sound followed almost immediately. "All that need now be done is for the men to widen the entrance. In the meantime we will go and fetch a ladder and lights, as much light as possible." "We have pine torches," said the officer. "That will do capitally." Paul was right. When the ladder was let down and he had descended with the lieutenant and Bernard, they saw a very large hall, whose vaults were supported by massive pillars which divided it, like a church of irregular design, into 2 main naves, with narrower and lower side aisles. But Paul at once called his companion's attention to the floor of those 2 naves. "A concrete flooring, do you see? And look here, as I expected, 2 rails running along one of the upper galleries. And here are 2 more rails in the other gallery." "But what does it all mean?" exclaimed Bernard and the lieutenant. "It means simply this," said Paul, "that we have before us what is evidently the explanation of the great mystery surrounding the capture of Corvigny and its 2 forts." "How?" "Corvigny and its 2 forts were demolished in a few minutes, weren't they? Where did those gunshots come from, considering that Corvigny is 15 miles from the frontier and that not one of the enemy's guns had crossed the frontier? They came from here, from this underground fortress." "Impossible." "Here are the rails on which they moved the 2 gigantic pieces which were responsible for the bombardment." "I say, you can't bombard from the bottom of a cavern. Where are the embrasures?" "The rails will take us there. Show a good light, Bernard. Look, here's a platform mounted on a pivot. It's a good size, eh? And here's the other platform." "But the embrasures?" "In front of you, Bernard. That's a wall. It's the wall which, together with the rock of the hill, supports the terrace above the Liseron opposite Corvigny. And 2 circular breaches were made in the wall and afterwards closed up again. You can see the traces of the closing quite plainly." Bernard and the lieutenant could not get over their astonishment. "Why, it's an enormous work," said the officer. "Absolutely colossal," replied Paul. "But don't be too much surprised, my dear fellow. It was begun 16 or 17 years ago, to my own knowledge. Besides, as I told you, part of the work was already done, because we are in the lower rooms of the old Ornequin buildings, and having found them, all they had to do was to arrange them according to the object which they had in view. There is something much more astounding, though." "What is that?" "The tunnel which they had to build in order to bring their 2 pieces here." "A tunnel?" "Well, of course. How do you expect they got here? Let's follow the rails in the other direction and we'll soon come to the tunnel." As he anticipated, the 2 sets of rails joined a little way back and they saw the yawning entrance to a tunnel about 9 feet wide and the same height. It dipped underground, sloping very gently. The walls were of brick. No damp oozed through the walls and the ground itself was perfectly dry. "Èbrecourt branch line," said Paul, laughing. 7 miles in the shade. And that is how the stronghold of Corvigny was bagged. First a few thousand men passed through, who killed off the little Ornequin garrison and the posts on the frontier, and then went on to the town. At the same time, the two huge guns were brought up, mounted and trained upon sites located beforehand. When these had done their business, they were removed and the holes stopped up. All this didn't take 2 hours. But to achieve those 2 decisive hours, the Kaiser worked for 17 years, bless him, said Bernard. Well, let's make a start. Would you like my men to go with you, suggested the lieutenant. No, thank you. It's better that my brother-in-law and I should go by ourselves. If we find, however, that the enemy has destroyed his tunnel, we will come back and ask for help. But it will astonish me if he has. Apart from the fact that he has taken every precaution lest the existence of the tunnel should be discovered, he is likely to have kept it intact in case he himself might want to use it again. And so, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the two brothers-in-law started on their walk down the Imperial Tunnel, as Bernard called it. They were well armed, supplied with provisions and ammunition, and resolved to pursue the adventure to the end. In a few minutes, that is to say 200 yards farther on, the light of their pocket lantern showed them the steps of a staircase on their right. "First turning," remarked Paul. "I take it there must be at least 3 of them. Where does the staircase lead to?" "To the château, obviously. And, if you want to know to what part, I say to the room with the portrait. There is no doubt that this is the way by which Major Hermann entered the château on the evening of the day when we attacked it. He had his accomplice Karl with him. Seeing our names written on the wall, they stabbed the 2 men sleeping in the room, Private Gériflour and his comrade." Bernard d'Andeville stopped short. "Look here, Paul, you've been bewildering me all day. You're acting with the most extraordinary insight, going straight to the right place at which to dig, describing all that happened as if you had been there, knowing everything and foreseeing everything. I never suspected you of that particular gift. Have you been studying Sherlock Holmes?" "Not even Arsene Lupin," said Paul, moving on again. "But I've been ill and I have thought things over. Certain passages in Elizabeth's diary, in which she spoke of her perplexing discoveries, gave me the first hint. I began by asking myself why the Germans had taken such pains to create a desert all around the château, and in this way, putting 2 and 2 together, drawing inference after inference, examining the past and the present, remembering my meeting with the German Emperor and a number of things which are all linked together, I ended by coming to the conclusion that there was bound to be a secret communication between the German and the French sides of the frontier, terminating at the exact place from which it was possible to fire on Corvigny. It seemed to me that, a priori, this place must be the terrace, and I became quite sure of it when, just now, I saw on the terrace a dead tree, overgrown with ivy, near which Elizabeth thought that she heard sounds coming from underground. From that moment I had nothing to do but get to work." "And your object is?" asked Bernard. "I have only one object, to deliver Elizabeth." "Your plan?" "I haven't one. Everything will depend on circumstances. But I am convinced that I am on the right track." In fact, all his surmises were proving to be correct. In 10 minutes they reached a space where another tunnel, also supplied with rails, branched off to the right. "Second turning," said Paul. "Corvigny Road. It was down here that the Germans marched to the town and took our troops by surprise before they even had time to assemble. It was down here that the peasant woman went who accosted you in the evening. The outlet must be at some distance from the town, perhaps in a farm belonging to the supposed peasant woman." "And the third turning?" said Bernard. "Here it is." "Another staircase?" "Yes, and I have no doubt that it leads to the chapel. We may safely presume that, on the day when my father was murdered, the Emperor had come to examine the works which he had ordered and which were being executed under the supervision of the woman who accompanied him. The chapel, which at that time was not inside the walls of the park, is evidently one of the exits from the secret network of roads of which we are following the main thoroughfare." Paul saw 2 more of these ramifications, which, judging from their position and direction, must issue near the frontier, thus completing a marvelous system of espionage and invasion. "It's wonderful," said Bernard. "It's admirable. If this isn't Kultur, I should like to know what is. One can see that these people have the true sense of war. The idea of digging for 20 years at a tunnel intended for the possible bombardment of a tiny fortress would never have occurred to a Frenchman. It needs a degree of civilization to which we can't lay claim. Did you ever know such beggars?" His enthusiasm increased still further when he observed that the roof of the tunnel was supplied with ventilating shafts. But at last Paul enjoined him to keep silent or to speak in a whisper. You can imagine that as they thought fit to preserve their lines of communication, they must have done something to make them unserviceable to the French. Èbrecourt is not far off. Perhaps there are listening posts, sentries posted at the right places. These people leave nothing to chance. One thing that lent weight to Paul's remark was the presence, between the rails, of those cast-iron slabs which covered the chambers of mines laid in advance, so that they could be exploded by electricity. The first was numbered 5, the second 4, and so on. Paul and Bernard avoided them carefully, and this delayed their progress, for they no longer dared switch on their lamps except at brief intervals. At about 7 o'clock they heard, or rather they seemed to hear, confused sounds of life and movement on the ground overhead. They felt deeply moved. The soil above them was German soil, and the echo brought the sounds of German life. "It's curious, you know, that the tunnel isn't better watched, and that we've been able to come so far without accident." "We'll give them a bad mark for that," said Bernard. "Kultur has made a slip." Meanwhile a brisker draught blew along the walls. The outside air entered in cool gusts, and they suddenly saw a distant light through the darkness. It was stationary. Everything around it seemed still, as though it were one of those fixed signals which are put up near a railway. When they came closer, they perceived that it was the light of an electric arc lamp, that it was burning inside a shed standing at the exit of the tunnel, and its rays were cast upon great white cliffs and upon little mounds of sand and pebbles. Paul whispered, "Those are quarries. By placing the entrance to their tunnel there, they were able to continue their works in time of peace without attracting attention. You may be sure that those so-called quarries were worked very discreetly, in a compound to which the workmen were confined." "What Kultur?" Bernard repeated. He felt Paul's hand grip his arm. Something had passed in front of the light, like a shadow rising and falling immediately after. With infinite caution they crawled up to the shed and raised themselves until their eyes were on a level with the windows. Inside were half a dozen soldiers, all lying down, or rather sprawling one across the other, among empty bottles, dirty plates, greasy paper wrappers, and remnants of broken victuals. They were the men told off to guard the tunnel, and they were dead drunk. "More Kultur," said Bernard. "We're in luck," said Paul. "And now I understand why the watch is so ill kept. This is Sunday." There was a telegraph apparatus on a table and a telephone on the wall, and Paul saw under a glass case a switchboard with 5 brass handles, which evidently corresponded by electric wires with the 5 mine chambers in the tunnel. When they passed on, Bernard and Paul continued to follow the rails along the bed of a narrow channel hollowed out of the rock, which led them to an open space bright with many lights. A whole village lay before them, consisting of barracks inhabited by soldiers, whom they saw moving to and fro. They went outside it. They then noticed the sound of a motor car and the blinding rays of 2 headlights, and after climbing a fence and passing through a shrubbery, they saw a large villa lit up from top to bottom. The car stopped in front of the doorstep, where some footmen were standing, as well as a guard of soldiers. 2 officers and a lady wrapped in furs alighted. When the car turned, the lights revealed a large garden, contained within very high walls. "It is just as I thought," said Paul. "This forms the counterpart of the Château d'Ornequin. At either end there are strong walls which allow work to be done unobserved by prying eyes. The terminus is in the open air here instead of underground, as it is down there, but at least the quarries, the workyards, the barracks, the garrison, the villa belonging to the staff, the garden, the stables, all this military organization is surrounded by walls and no doubt guarded on the outside by sentries. That explains why one is able to move about so freely inside." At that moment a second motor car set down 3 officers and then joined the other in the coach house. "There's a dinner party on," said Bernard. They resolved to approach as near as they could, under cover of the thick clumps of shrubs planted along the carriage drive which surrounded the house. They waited for some time, and then, from the sound of voices and laughter that came from the ground floor at the back, they concluded that this must be the scene of the banquet and that the guests were sitting down to dinner. There were bursts of song, shouts of applause. Outside, nothing stirred. The garden was deserted. "The place seems quiet," said Paul. "I shall ask you to give me a leg up and to keep hidden yourself. You want to climb to the ledge of one of those windows? What about the shutters?" "I don't expect they're very close. You can see the light shining through the middle." "Well, but why are you doing it? There's no reason to bother about this house more than any other." "Yes, there is. You yourself told me that one of the wounded prisoners said Prince Conrad had taken up his quarters in a villa outside Èbrecourt. Now this one, standing in the middle of a sort of entrenched camp and at the entrance to the tunnel, seems to me marked out. Not to mention this really princely dinner party," said Bernard, laughing. "You're right. Up you go." They crossed the walk. With Bernard's assistance, Paul was easily able to grip the ledge above the basement floor and to hoist himself to the stone balcony. "That's it," he said. "Go back to where we were and whistle in case of danger." After bestriding the balustrade, he carefully loosened one of the shutters by passing first his fingers and then his hand through the intervening space, and he succeeded in unfastening the bolt. The curtains, being crossed inside, enabled him to move about unseen, but they were open at the top, leaving an inverted triangle through which he could see by climbing onto the balustrade. He did so, and then bent forward and looked. The sight that met his eyes was such, and gave him so horrible a blow, that his legs began to shake beneath him. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 15. Prince Conrad makes merry. A table running parallel with the 3 windows of the room. An incredible collection of bottles, decanters and glasses, hardly leaving room for the dishes of cake and fruit. Ornamental side dishes flanked by bottles of champagne. A basket of flowers surrounded by liqueur bottles. 20 persons were seated at table, including half a dozen women in low-necked dresses. The others were officers covered with gold lace and orders. In the middle, facing the window, sat Prince Conrad, presiding over the banquet, with a lady on his right and another on his left. And it was the sight of these 3, brought together in the most improbable defiance of the logic of things, that caused Paul to undergo a torture which was renewed from moment to moment. That one of the 2 women should be there, on the prince's right, sitting stiff-backed in her plum-coloured stuff gown, with a black lace scarf half hiding her short hair, was easy to understand. But the other woman, to whom Prince Conrad kept turning with a clumsy affectation of gallantry, that woman whom Paul contemplated with horror-struck eyes and whom he would have liked to strangle where she sat, what was she doing there? What was Elizabeth doing in the midst of those tipsy officers and dubious German women, beside Prince Conrad and beside the monstrous creature who was pursuing her with her hatred? The Comtesse Hermine d'Andeville, Elizabeth d'Andeville, the mother and the daughter. There was no plausible argument that would allow Paul to apply any other description to the prince's 2 companions. and something happened to give this description its full value of hideous reality, when, a moment later, Prince Conrad rose to his feet with a glass of champagne in his hand and shouted, "Hoch, hoch, hoch! Here's to the health of our very wide-awake friend!" "Hoch, hoch, hoch!" shouted the band of guests. "The Comtesse Hermine!" She took up a glass, emptied it at a draught, and began to make a speech which Paul could not hear, while the others did their best to listen with a fervent attention, which was all the more meritorious in view of their copious libations. And Élisabeth also sat and listened. She was wearing a grey gown which Paul knew well, quite a simple frock, cut very high in the neck, and with sleeves that came down to her wrists. But from her throat a wonderful necklace consisting of 4 rows of large pearls hung over her bodice, and this necklace Paul did not know. "The wretch! The wretch!" he spluttered. She was smiling. Yes, he saw on the younger woman's lips a smile provoked by something that Prince Conrad said as he bent over her. And the prince gave such a boisterous laugh that the Comtesse Hermine, who was still speaking, called him to order by tapping him on the hand with her fan. The whole scene was a horrible one for Paul, and he suffered such scorching anguish that his one idea was to get away, to see no more, to abandon the struggle, and to drive this hateful wife of his out of his life and out of his memory. "She is a true daughter of the Comtesse Hermine," he thought in despair. He was on the point of going when a little incident held him back. Élisabeth raised to her eyes a handkerchief which she held crumpled in the hollow of her hand, and furtively wiped away a tear that was ready to flow. At the same time he perceived that she was terribly pale, not with a factitious pallor, which until then he had attributed to the crudeness of the light, but with a real and deathly pallor. It was as though all the blood had fled from her poor face, and after all, what a melancholy smile was that which had twisted her lips in response to the prince's jest. "But then what is she doing here?" Paul asked himself. "Am I not entitled to regard her as guilty and to suppose that her tears are due to remorse? She has become cowardly through fear, threats, and the wish to live, and now she is crying." He continued to insult her in his thoughts. But gradually he felt a great pity steal over him for the woman who had not the strength to endure her intolerable trials. Meanwhile, the Comtesse Hermine made an end of her speech. She drank again, swallowing bumper after bumper, and each time flinging her glass behind her. The officers and their women followed her example. Enthusiastic "hochs" were raised on every side, and in a drunken fit of patriotism the prince got on his feet and struck up "Deutschland über alles," the others joining in the chorus with a sort of frenzy. Élisabeth had put her elbows on the table and her hands before her face, as though trying to isolate herself from her surroundings. But the prince, still standing and bawling, took her 2 arms and brutally forced them apart. "None of your monkey tricks, pretty one." She gave a movement of repulsion which threw him beside himself. "What's all this? Sulking and blubbering? A nice thing! And bless my soul, what do I see? Madame's glass is full." He took the glass and with a shaky hand put it to Élisabeth's lips. "Drink my health, child, the health of your lord and master. What's this? You refuse? Ah, I see you don't like champagne. Quite right. Down with champagne. What you want is hock, good Rhine wine, eh, baby? You're thinking of one of your country's songs. We held it once, your German Rhine. It babbled in our brimming glass. Rhine wine there." With one movement, the officers rose and started shouting, "Die Wacht am Rhein." "They shall not have our German Rhine, though like a flock of hungry crows they shriek their lust." "No, they shan't have it," rejoined the prince angrily. "But you shall drink it, little one." Another glass had been filled. Once more he tried to force Élisabeth to lift it to her lips, and when she pushed it away, he began to whisper in her ear while the wine dribbled over her dress. Everybody was silent, waiting to see what would happen. Élisabeth turned paler than ever, but did not move. The prince, leaning over her, showed the face of a brute who alternately threatens, pleads, commands, and insults. It was a heart-rending sight. Paul would have given his life to see Élisabeth yield to a fit of disgust and stab her insulter. Instead of that, she threw back her head, closed her eyes and, half swooning, accepted the chalice and swallowed a few mouthfuls. The prince gave a shout of triumph as he waved the glass on high. Then he put his lips avidly to the place at which she had drunk and emptied it at a draught. "Hoch! Hoch!" he roared. "Up, comrades! Everyone on his chair, with one foot on the table! Up, conquerors of the world! Sing the strength of Germany! Sing German gallantry! The Rhine, the free, the German Rhine, they shall not have, while gallant boys still tell of love to slender maids. Élisabeth, I have drunk Rhine wine from your glass. Élisabeth, I know what you are thinking. Her thoughts are of love, my comrades. I am the master. Oh, Parisienne, you dear little Parisienne. It's Paris we want. Oh, Paris, Paris!" His foot slipped. The glass fell from his hand and smashed against the neck of a bottle. He dropped on his knees on the table, amid a crash of broken plates and glasses, seized a flask of liqueur and rolled to the floor, stammering, "We want Paris, Paris and Calais. Papa said so. The Arc de Triomphe, the Café Anglais, a cabinet particulier at the Café Anglais." The uproar suddenly stopped. The Comtesse Hermine's imperious voice was raised in command. "Go away, all of you. Go home, and be quick about it, gentlemen, if you please." The officers and the ladies soon made themselves scarce. Outside, on the other side of the house, there was a great deal of whistling. The cars at once drove up from the garage. A general departure took place. Meanwhile, the Comtesse had beckoned to the servants and, pointing to Prince Conrad, said, "Carry him to his room." The prince was removed at once. Then the Comtesse Hermine went up to Élisabeth. Not 5 minutes had elapsed since the prince rolled under the table, and after the din of the banquet, a great silence reigned in the disorderly room where the two women were now by themselves. Élisabeth had once more hidden her head in her hands and was weeping violently, with sobs that shook her shoulders. The Comtesse Hermine sat down beside her and gently touched her on the arm. The two women looked at each other without a word. It was a strange glance that they exchanged, a glance laden with mutual hatred. Paul did not take his eyes from them. As he watched the two of them, he could not doubt that they had met before, and that the words which they were about to speak were but the sequel and conclusion of some earlier discussion. But what discussion? And what did Élisabeth know of the Comtesse Hermine? Did she accept that woman for whom she felt such loathing as her mother? Never were two human beings distinguished by a greater difference in physical appearance, and above all by expressions of face denoting more opposite natures. And yet how powerful were the series of proofs that linked them together! These were no longer proofs, but rather the factors of so actual a reality that Paul did not even dream of discussing them. Besides, M. d'Andeville's confusion when confronted with the Comtesse's photograph, a photograph taken in Berlin some years after her pretended death, showed that M. d'Andeville was an accessory to that pretended death, and perhaps an accessory to many other things. And Paul came back to the question provoked by the agonizing encounter between the mother and daughter. What did Élisabeth know of it all? What insight had she been able to obtain into the whole monstrous conglomeration of shame, infamy, treachery, and crime? Was she accusing her mother? And feeling herself crushed under the weight of the crimes, did she hold her responsible for her own lack of courage? Yes, of course she does, thought Paul. But why so much hatred? There is a hatred between them which only death can quench. And the longing to kill is perhaps even more violent in the eyes of Élisabeth than in those of the woman who has come to kill her. Paul felt this impression so keenly that he really expected one or the other to take some immediate action, and he began to cast about for a means of saving Élisabeth. But an utterly unforeseen thing happened. The Comtesse Hermine took from her pocket one of those large road maps which motorists use, placed her finger at one spot, followed the red line of a road to another spot, and stopping, spoke a few words that seemed to drive Elizabeth mad with delight. She seized the Countess by the arm and began to talk to her feverishly, in words interrupted by alternate laughing and sobbing, while the Countess nodded her head and seemed to be saying, "That's all right. We are agreed. Everything shall be as you wish." Paul thought that Elizabeth was actually going to kiss her enemy's hand, for she seemed overcome with joy and gratitude, and he was anxiously wondering into what new trap the poor thing had fallen, when the Countess rose, walked to the door and opened it. She beckoned to someone outside and then came back again. A man entered, dressed in uniform, and Paul now understood. The man whom the Comtesse Hermine was admitting was Karl the spy, her confederate, the agent of her designs, the man whom she was entrusting with the task of killing Elizabeth, whose last hour had struck. Karl bowed. The Comtesse Hermine introduced the man to Elizabeth, and then, pointing to the road and the two places on the map, explained what was expected of him. He took out his watch and made a gesture as though to say, "It shall be done at such and such a time." Thereupon, at the Countess's suggestion, Elizabeth left the room. Although Paul had not caught a single word of what was said, this brief scene was for him pregnant with the plainest and most terrifying significance. The Countess, using her absolute power and taking advantage of the fact that Prince Conrad was asleep, was proposing a plan of escape to Elizabeth, doubtless a flight by motor car, towards a spot in the neighboring district thought out in advance. Elizabeth was accepting this unhoped-for deliverance, and the flight would take place under the management and protection of Karl. The trap was so well laid, and Elizabeth, driven mad with suffering, was rushing into it so confidently that the two accomplices, on being left alone, looked at each other and laughed. The trick was really too easy, and there was no merit in succeeding under such conditions. There next took place between them, even before any explanation was entered into, a short pantomime. 2 movements, no more, but they were marked with diabolical cynicism. With his eyes fixed on the Countess, Karl the spy opened his jacket and drew a dagger halfway out of its sheath. The Countess made a sign of disapproval and handed the scoundrel a little bottle, which he took with a shrug of the shoulders, apparently saying, "As you please, it's all the same to me." Then, sitting side by side, they embarked on a lively conversation, the Countess giving her instructions, while Karl expressed his approval or his dissent. Paul had a feeling that if he did not master his dismay, if he did not stop the disordered beating of his heart, Elizabeth was lost. To save her, he must keep his brain absolutely clear and take immediate resolutions as circumstances demanded, without giving himself time to reflect or hesitate. And these resolutions he could only take at a venture, and perhaps erroneously, because he did not really know the enemy's plans. Nevertheless, he cocked his revolver. He was at that moment presuming that when Elizabeth was ready to start, she would return to the room and go away with the spy. But presently the Countess struck a bell on the table and spoke a few words to the servant who appeared. The man went out. Paul heard 2 whistles, followed by the hum of an approaching motor. Karl looked through the open door and down the passage. Then he turned to the Countess as though to say, "Here she is. She's coming down the stairs." Paul now understood that Elizabeth should go straight to the car and that Karl would join her there. If so, it was a case for immediate action. For a second he remained undecided. Should he take advantage of the fact that Karl was still there, burst into the room and shoot both him and the Countess dead? It would mean saving Elizabeth, because it was only those 2 miscreants who had designs upon her life. But he dreaded the failure of so daring an attempt, and jumping from the balcony, he called Bernard. "Elizabeth is going off in a motor car. Karl is with her and has been told to poison her. Get out your revolver and come with me." "What do you intend to do?" "We shall see." They went round the villa, slipping through the bushes that bordered the drive. The whole place, moreover, was deserted. "Listen," said Bernard, "there's a car going off." Paul, at first greatly alarmed, protested: "No, no, it's only the noise of the engine." In fact, when they came within sight of the front of the house, they saw at the foot of the steps a closed car surrounded by a group of some dozen soldiers. Its headlamps, while lighting up one part of the garden, left the spot where Paul and Bernard stood in darkness. A woman came down the steps and disappeared into the car. "Élisabeth," said Paul, "and here comes Karl." The spy stopped on the bottom step and gave his orders to the soldier who acted as chauffeur. Paul caught a syllable here and there. Their departure was imminent. Another moment and, if Paul raised no obstacle, the car would carry off the assassin and his victim. It was a horrible minute, for Paul Delroze felt all the danger attending an interference which would not even possess the merit of being effective, since Karl's death would not prevent the Comtesse Hermine from pursuing her ends. Bernard whispered: "Surely you don't mean to carry away Élisabeth? There's a whole picket of sentries there." "I mean to do only one thing, to do for Karl." "And then?" "Then they'll take us prisoners. We shall be questioned, cross-examined. There will be a scandal. Prince Conrad will take the matter up." "And we shall be shot. I confess that your plan—" "Can you propose a better one?" He broke off. Karl the spy had flown into a rage and was storming at his chauffeur. And Paul heard him shout: "You damned ass! You're always doing it! No petrol? Where do you think we shall find petrol in the middle of the night? There's some in the garage, is there? Then run and fetch it, you fathead. And where's my fur coat? You've forgotten it? Go and get it at once. I shall drive the car myself. I've no use for fools like you." The soldier started running, and Paul at once observed that he himself would be able to reach the garage, of which he saw the lights, without having to leave the protecting darkness. "Come," he said to Bernard, "I have an idea. You'll see what it is." With the sound of their footsteps deadened by the grassy lawn, they made for that part of the outhouses containing the stables and motor sheds, which they were able to enter unseen by those without. The soldier was in a back room, the door of which was open. From their hiding place they saw him take from a peg a great goatskin coat, which he threw over his shoulder, and lay hold of 4 tins of petrol. Thus laden, he left the back room and passed in front of Paul and Bernard. The trick was soon done. Before he had time to cry out, he was knocked down, rendered motionless and gagged. "That's that," said Paul. "Now give me his greatcoat and his cap. I would rather have avoided this disguise, but if you want to be sure of a thing, you mustn't stick at the means." "Then you're going to risk it?" asked Bernard. "Suppose Karl doesn't recognize his chauffeur?" "He won't even think of looking at him." "But if he speaks to you?" "I shan't answer. Besides, once we are outside the grounds, I shall have nothing to fear from him." "And what am I to do?" "You? Bind your prisoner carefully and lock him up in some safe place. Then go back to the shrubbery, beyond the window with the balcony. I hope to join you there with Élisabeth sometime during the middle of the night, and we shall simply have to go back by the tunnel. If by accident you don't see me return—" "Well?" "Well, then go back alone before it gets light." "But—" Paul was already moving away. He was in the mood in which a man refuses to consider the actions which he has decided to perform. Moreover, the event seemed to prove that he was right. Karl received him with abusive language, but without paying the least attention to this supernumerary, for whom he could not show enough contempt. The spy put on his fur coat, sat down at the wheel and began to handle the levers, while Paul took the seat beside him. The car was starting when a voice from the doorstep called, in a tone of command: "Karl, stop!" Paul felt a moment's anxiety. It was the Comtesse Hermine. She went up to the spy and, lowering her voice, said in French: "I want you, Karl, to be sure. But your driver doesn't know French, does he?" "He hardly knows German, Excellenz. He's an idiot. You can speak freely." "What I was going to say is, don't use more than 10 drops out of the bottle, else—" "Very well, Excellenz. Anything more?" "Write to me in a week's time if everything has gone off well. Write to our Paris address and not before. It would be useless." "Then you're going back to France, Excellenz?" Yes, my plan is ripe." "The same plan?" "Yes, the weather is in our favor. It has been raining for days and the staff have told me that they mean to act on their side. So I shall be there tomorrow evening, and it will need only a touch of the thumb." "That's it, a touch of the thumb, no more. I've worked at it myself and everything's ready. But you spoke to me of another plan to complete the first, and I confess that that one—" "It's got to be done. Luck is turning against us. If I succeed, it will be the end of the run on the black." "And have you the Kaiser's consent?" "I didn't ask for it. It's one of those undertakings one doesn't talk about." "But this one is terribly dangerous, Excellenz." "Can't be helped." "Shan't you want me over there, Excellenz?" "No, get rid of the chit for us. That will be enough for the present. Good-bye." "Good-bye, Excellenz." The spy released the brakes. The car started. The drive which ran round the central lawn led to a lodge which stood beside the garden gate and which served as a guard room. The high walls surrounding the grounds rose on either side of it. An officer came out of the lodge. Karl gave the password, Hohenstaufen. The gate was opened and the motor dashed down a high road which first passed through the little town of Èbrecourt and next wound among low hills. So Paul Delroze, at an hour before midnight, was alone in the open country with Élisabeth and Karl the spy. If he succeeded in mastering the spy, as he did not doubt that he could, Élisabeth would be free. There would then remain nothing to do but to return to Prince Conrad's villa with the aid of the password and pick up Bernard there. Once the adventure was completed in accordance with Paul's designs, the tunnel would bring back all the three of them to the Château d'Ornequin. Paul therefore gave way to the delight that was stealing over him. Élisabeth was with him under his protection. Élisabeth, whose courage no doubt had yielded under the weight of her trials, but who had a claim upon his indulgence because her misfortunes were due to his fault. He wished to forget all the ugly phases in the tragedy, in order to think only of the end that was near at hand, his wife's triumph and deliverance. He watched the road attentively so as not to miss his way when returning and planned out his attack, fixing it at the first stop which they would have to make. He resolved that he would not kill the spy, but that he would stun him with a blow of his fist and, after knocking him down and binding him, throw him into some wood by the roadside. They came to a fair-sized market town, then 2 villages, and then a town where they had to stop and show the car's papers. It was past 11. Then once more they were driving along country lanes which ran through a series of little woods, whose trees lit up as they passed. At that moment the light of the lamps began to fail. Karl slackened speed. He growled, "You dolt, can't you even keep your lamps alight? Have you got any carbide?" Paul did not reply. Karl went on cursing his luck. Suddenly he put on the brakes with an oath. "You blasted idiot! One can't go on like this. Here, stir your stumps and light up." Paul sprang from his seat while the car drew up by the roadside. The time had come to act. He first attended to the lamps, keeping an eye upon the spy's movements and taking care to stand outside the rays. Karl got down, opened the door of the car and started a conversation which Paul could not hear. Then he came back to where Paul was. "Well, Puddinghead, haven't you done yet?" Paul had his back turned to him, attending to his work and waiting for the propitious moment when the spy, coming 2 steps nearer, would be within his reach. A minute elapsed. He clenched his fists. He foresaw the exact movement which he would have to make and was on the point of making it, when suddenly he felt himself seized round the body from behind and brought to the ground without being able to offer the least resistance. "Thunder and lightning!" cried the spy, holding him down with his knee. "So that's why you wouldn't answer. It struck me somehow that you were behaving queerly, and then I never gave it another thought. It was the lamp just now that threw light on your side face. But who is this fellow I've got hold of? Some dog of a Frenchman, maybe?" Paul had stiffened his muscles and believed for a moment that he would succeed in escaping from the other's grip. The enemy's strength was yielding. Paul gradually seemed to master him, and he exclaimed, "Yes, a Frenchman, Paul Delroze, the one you used to try and kill, the husband of Elizabeth, your victim. Yes, it's I, and I know who you are. You're Laschen, the sham Belgian. You're Karl the spy." He stopped. The spy, who had only weakened his effort to draw a dagger from his belt, was now raising it against him. "Ah, Paul Delroze! God's truth, this'll be a lucky trip. First the husband and then the wife. Ah, so you came running into my clutches. Here, take this, my lad." Paul saw the gleam of a blade flashing above his face. He closed his eyes, uttering Elizabeth's name. Another second, and 3 shots rang out in rapid succession. Someone was firing from behind the group formed by the 2 adversaries. The spy swore a hideous oath. His grip became relaxed. The weapon in the hand trembled, and he fell flat on the ground, moaning, "Oh, the cursed woman! That cursed woman! I ought to have strangled her in the car. I knew this would happen." His voice failed him. He stammered, "I've got it this time. Oh, that cursed woman! And the pain." Then he was silent. A few convulsions, a dying gasp, and that was all. Paul had leapt to his feet. He ran to the woman who had saved his life and who was still holding her revolver in her hand. "Elizabeth!" he cried, wild with delight. But he stopped, with his arms outstretched. In the dark, the woman's figure did not seem to him to be Elizabeth's, but a taller and broader figure. He blurted out in a tone of infinite anguish, "Elizabeth, is it you? Is it really you?" And at the same time he intuitively knew the answer which he was about to hear. "No," said the woman. "Madame Delroze started a little before us in another motor. Karl and I were to join her." Paul remembered that car, of which he and Bernard had thought that he had heard the sound when going round the villa. As the 2 starts had taken place with an interval of a few minutes at most between them, he cried, "Let us be quick then and lose no time. By putting on speed we will be sure to catch them." But the woman at once objected, "It's impossible, because the 2 cars have taken different roads." "What does that matter if they lead to the same point? Where are they taking Madame Delroze?" "To a castle belonging to the Comtesse Hermine." "And where is that castle?" "I don't know." "You don't know? But this is terrible. At least you know its name." "No, I don't. Karl never told me." Chapter 16 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 16. The Impossible Struggle. In the terrible state of distress into which those last words threw him, Paul felt the need of some immediate action, even as he had done at the sight of the banquet given by Prince Conrad. Certainly all hope was lost. His plan, which was to use the tunnel before the alarm was raised, his plan was shattered. Granting that he succeeded in finding Elizabeth and delivering her, a very unlikely contingency, at what moment would this take place? And how was he afterwards to escape the enemy and return to France? No, henceforward space and time were both against him. His defeat was such that there was nothing for it but to resign himself and await the final blow. And yet he did not flinch. He saw that any weakness would be irreparable. The impulse that had carried him so far must be continued unchecked and with more vigor than ever. He walked up to the spy. The woman was stooping over the body and examining it by the light of one of the lamps which she had taken down. "He's dead, isn't he?" asked Paul. "Yes, he's dead. 2 bullets hit him in the back." And she murmured in a broken voice, "It's horrible what I've done. I've killed him myself. But it's not murder, sir, is it? And I had the right to, hadn't I? But it's horrible all the same. I've killed Karl." Her face, which was young and still rather pretty, though common, was distorted. Her eyes seemed glued to the corpse. "Who are you?" asked Paul. She replied, sobbing, "I was his sweetheart, and better than that, or rather worse. He had taken an oath that he would marry me. But Karl's oath! He was such a liar, sir, such a coward. Oh, the things I know of him! I myself, simply through holding my tongue, gradually became his accomplice. He used to frighten me so. I no longer loved him, but I was afraid of him and obeyed him, with such loathing at the end. And he knew how I loathed him. He used often to say, 'You are quite capable of killing me some day or other.' No, sir, I did think of it, but I should never have had the courage. It was only just now, when I saw that he was going to stab you, and above all, when I heard your name." "My name? What has that to do with it?" "You're Madame Delroze's husband." "Well?" "Well, I know her. Not for long, only since to-day. This morning Karl, on his way from Belgium, passed through the town where I was and took me to Prince Conrad's. He told me I was to be lady's maid to a French lady whom we were going to take to a castle. I knew what that meant. I should have once more to be his accomplice, to inspire confidence. And then I saw that French lady. I saw her crying, and she was so gentle and kind that I felt sorry for her. I promised to rescue her. Only I never thought that it would be in this way, by killing Karl." She drew herself up suddenly and said in a hard voice, "But it had to be, sir. It was bound to happen, for I knew too much about him. It had to be he or I. It was he. And I can't help it, and I'm not sorry. He was the wickedest wretch on earth, and with people like him one mustn't hesitate. No, I am not sorry." Paul asked, "He was devoted to the Comtesse Hermine, was he not?" She shuddered and lowered her voice to reply, "Oh, don't speak of her, please. She is more terrible still, and she is still alive. Ah, if she should ever suspect!" "Who is the woman?" "How can I tell? She comes and goes. She is the mistress wherever she may be. People obey her as they do the Emperor. Everybody fears her, as they do her brother." "Her brother?" "Yes, Major Hermann." "What's that? Do you mean to say that Major Hermann is her brother?" "Why, of course. Besides, you only have to look at him. He is the very image of the Comtesse Hermine." "Have you ever seen them together?" "Upon my word, I can't remember. Why do you ask?" Time was too precious for Paul to insist. The woman's opinion of the Comtesse Hermine did not matter much. He asked, "She is staying at the prince's?" "For the present, yes. The prince is on the first floor, at the back. She is on the same floor, but in front." "If I let her know that Karl has had an accident and that he has sent me, his chauffeur, to tell her, will she see me?" "Certainly." "Does she know Karl's chauffeur, whose place I took?" "No, he was a soldier whom Karl brought with him from Belgium." Paul thought for a moment and then said, "Lend me a hand." They pushed the body towards the ditch by the roadside, rolled it in and covered it with dead branches. "I shall go back to the villa," he said. "You walk on until you come to the first cluster of houses. Wake the people and tell them the story of how Karl was murdered by his chauffeur and how you ran away. The time which it will take to inform the police, to question you and to telephone to the villa is more than I need." She took alarm. "But the Comtesse Hermine?" "Have no fear there. Granting that I do not deprive her of her power of doing mischief, how could she suspect you, when the police investigations will hold me alone to account for everything? Besides, we have no choice." And without more words he started the engine, took his seat at the wheel and, in spite of the woman's frightened entreaties, drove off. He drove off with the same eagerness and decision, as though he were fulfilling the conditions of some new plan of which he had fixed every detail beforehand, and as though he felt sure of its success. "I shall see the countess," he said to himself. "She will either be anxious as to Karl's fate and want me to take her to him at once, or she will see me in one of the rooms in the villa. In either case, I shall find a method of compelling her to reveal the name of the castle in which Elizabeth is a prisoner. I shall even compel her to give me the means of delivering her and helping her to escape." But how vague it all was! The obstacles in the way, the impossibilities! How could he expect circumstances to be so complaisant as first to blind the countess's eyes to the facts, and next to deprive her of all assistance? A woman of her stamp was not likely to let herself be taken in by words or subdued by threats. No matter. Paul would not entertain the thought of failure. Success lay at the end of his undertaking, and in order to achieve it more quickly he increased the pace, rushing his car like a whirlwind along the roads, and hardly slackening speed as he passed through villages and towns. "Hohenstaufen!" he cried to the sentry posted outside the wall. The officer of the picket, after questioning him, sent him on to the sergeant in command of the post at the front door. The sergeant was the only one who had free access to the villa, and he would inform the Countess. "Very well," said Paul. "I'll pull up my car first." In the garage he turned off his lights, and as he went towards the villa he thought that it might be well, before going back to the sergeant, to look up Bernard and learn if his brother-in-law had succeeded in discovering anything. He found him behind the villa, in the clumps of shrubs facing the window with the balcony. "You're by yourself?" said Bernard anxiously. "Yes, the job failed. Elizabeth was in an earlier motor." "What an awful thing!" "Yes, but it can be put right. And you, what about the chauffeur?" "He's safely hidden away. No one will see him, at least not before the morning, when other chauffeurs come to the garage." "Very well. Anything else?" "There was a patrol in the grounds an hour ago. I managed to keep out of sight." "And then?" "And then I made my way as far as the tunnel. The men were beginning to stir. Besides, there was something that made them jolly well pull themselves together." "What was that?" "The sudden arrival of a certain person of our acquaintance, the woman I met at Corvigny, who is so remarkably like Major Hermann." "Was she going the rounds?" "No, she was leaving." "Yes, I know. She means to leave." "She has left." "Oh, nonsense. I can't believe that. There was no immediate hurry about her departure for France." "I saw her go, though." "How? By what road?" "The tunnel, of course. Do you imagine that the tunnel serves no further purpose? That was the road she took, before my eyes, under the most comfortable conditions, in an electric trolley driven by brakesmen. No doubt, since the object of her journey was, as you say, to get to France, they shunted her on to the Corvigny branch. That was 2 hours ago. I heard the trolley come back." The disappearance of the Comtesse Hermine was a fresh blow to Paul. How was he now to find, how to deliver, Elizabeth? What clue could he trust in this darkness, in which each of his efforts was ending in disaster? He pulled himself together, made an act of will, and resolved to persevere in the adventure until he attained his object. He asked Bernard if he had seen nothing more. "No, nothing." "Nobody going or coming in the garden?" "No, the servants have gone to bed. The lights are out." "All the lights?" "All except one, there, over our heads." The light was on the first floor, at a window situated above the window through which Paul had watched Prince Conrad's supper party. He asked, "Was that light put on while I was up on the balcony?" "Yes, towards the end." "From what I was told," Paul muttered, "that must be Prince Conrad's room. He's drunk and had to be carried upstairs." "Yes, I saw some shadows at that time, and nothing has moved since." "He's evidently sleeping off his champagne. Oh, if one could only see, if one could get into the room!" "That's easily done," said Bernard. "How?" "Through the next room, which must be the dressing room. They've left the window open, no doubt to give the prince a little air." "But I should want a ladder." "There's one hanging on the wall of the coach house. Shall I get it for you?" "Yes, do," said Paul eagerly. "Be quick." A whole new scheme was taking shape in his mind, similar in some respects to his first plan of campaign, and likely, he thought, to lead to a successful issue. He made certain that the approaches to the villa on either side were deserted, and that none of the soldiers on guard had moved away from the front door. Then, when Bernard was back, he placed the ladder in position and leant it against the wall. They went up. The open window belonged, as they expected, to the dressing room, and the light from the bedroom showed through the open door. Not a sound came from that other room except a loud snoring. Paul put his head through the doorway. Prince Conrad was lying fast asleep across his bed, like a loose-jointed doll, clad in his uniform, the front of which was covered with stains. He was sleeping so soundly that Paul was able to examine the room at his ease. There was a sort of little lobby between it and the passage, with a door at either end. He locked and bolted both doors, so that they were now alone with Prince Conrad, while it was impossible for them to be heard from the outside. "Come on," said Paul, when they had apportioned the work to be done. And he placed a twisted towel over the prince's face and tried to insert the ends into his mouth, while Bernard bound his wrists and ankles with some more towels. All this was done in silence. The prince offered no resistance and uttered not a cry. He had opened his eyes and lay staring at his aggressors with the air of a man who does not understand what is happening to him, but is seized with increasing dread as he becomes aware of his danger. "Not much pluck about William's son and heir," chuckled Bernard. "Lord, what a funk he's in! Hi, young fellow, my lad, pull yourself together. Where's your smelling bottle?" Paul had at last succeeded in cramming half the towel into his mouth. He lifted him up and said, "Now, let's be off." "What do you propose to do?" "Take him away." "Where to?" "To France." "To France?" "Well, of course. We've got him. He'll have to help us." "They won't let him through." "And the tunnel?" "Out of the question. They're keeping too close a watch now." "We shall see." He took his revolver and pointed it at Prince Conrad. "Listen to me," he said. "Your head is too muddled, I dare say, to take in any questions, but a revolver is easy to understand, isn't it? It talks a very plain language, even to a man who is drunk and shaking all over with fright. Well, if you don't come with me quietly, if you attempt to struggle or to make a noise, if my friend and I are in danger for a single moment, you're done for. You can feel the barrel of my revolver on your temple. Well, it's there to blow out your brains. Do you agree to my conditions?" The prince nodded his head. "Good," said Paul. "Bernard, undo his legs, but fasten his arms along his body. That's it. And now let's be off." The descent of the ladder was easily accomplished, and they walked through the shrubberies to the fence which separated the garden from the yard containing the barracks. Here they handed the prince across to each other like a parcel, and then, taking the same road as when they came, they reached the quarries. The night was bright enough to allow them to see their way, and moreover they had in front of them a diffused glow which seemed to rise from the guard-house at the entrance to the tunnel. And indeed all the lights there were burning, and the men were standing outside the shed drinking coffee. A soldier was pacing up and down in front of the tunnel with his rifle on his shoulder. "We are two," whispered Bernard. "There are 6 of them, and at the first shot fired they will be joined by some hundreds of Boches who are quartered 5 minutes away. It's a bit of an unequal struggle. What do you say?" What increased the difficulty to the point of making it insuperable was that they were not really 2 but 3, and that their prisoner hampered them most terribly. With him it was impossible to hurry, impossible to run away. They would have to think of some stratagem to help them. Slowly, cautiously, stealing along in such a way that not a stone rolled from under their footsteps or the prince's, they described a circle under the lighted space which brought them, after an hour, close to the tunnel, under the rocky slopes against which its first buttresses were built. "Stay there," said Paul to Bernard, speaking very low, but just loud enough for the prince to hear. "Stay where you are and remember my instructions. First of all, take charge of the prince with your revolver in your right hand and with your left hand on his collar. If he struggles, break his head. That will be a bad business for us, but just as bad for him. I shall go back to a certain distance from the shed and draw off the 5 men on guard. Then the man doing sentry down there will either join the rest, in which case you go on with the prince, or else he will obey orders and remain at his post, in which case you fire at him and wound him, and go on with the prince." "Yes, I shall go on, but the Boches will come after me and catch us up." "No, they won't." "If you say so." "Very well, that's understood. And you, sir," said Paul to the prince, "do you understand? Absolute submission. If not, the least carelessness, a mere mistake, may cost you your life." Bernard whispered in his brother-in-law's ears, "I've picked up a rope. I shall fasten it round his neck, and if he jibs, he'll feel a sharp tug to recall him to the true state of things. Only, Paul, I warn you, if he takes it into his head to struggle, I am incapable of killing him just like that in cold blood." "Don't worry, he's too much afraid to struggle. He'll go with you like a lamb to the other end of the tunnel. When you get there, lock him up in some corner of the château, but don't tell anyone who he is." "And you, Paul?" "Never mind about me. Still, we both stand the same risk. We're going to play a terribly dangerous game, and there's every chance of our losing it. But if we win, it means Elizabeth's safety. So we must go for it boldly. Good-bye, Bernard, for the present. In 10 minutes everything will be settled one way or the other." They embraced, and Paul walked away. As he had said, this one last effort could succeed only through promptness and audacity, and it had to be made in the spirit in which a man makes a desperate move. 10 minutes more would see the end of the adventure. 10 minutes, and he would either be victorious or a dead man. Every action which he performed from that moment was as orderly and methodical as if he had had time to think it out carefully and to ensure its inevitable success, whereas in reality he was forming a series of separate decisions as he went along and as the tragic circumstances seemed to call for them. Taking a roundabout way and keeping to the slopes of the mounds formed by the sand thrown up in the works, he reached the hollow communication road between the quarries and the garrison camp. On the last of these rounds, his foot struck a block of stone which gave way beneath him. On stooping and groping with his hands, he perceived that this block held quite a heap of sand and pebbles in position behind it. "That's what I want," he said, without a moment's reflection, and giving the stone a mighty kick, he sent the heap shooting into the road with a roar like an avalanche. Paul jumped down among the stones, lay flat on his chest, and began to scream for help as though he had met with an accident. From where he lay it was impossible, owing to the winding of the road, to hear him in the barracks, but the least cry was bound to carry as far as the shed at the mouth of the tunnel, which was only 100 yards away at most. The soldiers on guard came running along at once. He counted only 5 of them. In an almost unintelligible voice he gave incoherent, gasping replies to the corporal's questions, and conveyed the impression that he had been sent by Prince Conrad to bring back the Comtesse Hermine. Paul was quite aware that his stratagem had no chance of succeeding beyond a very brief space of time, but every minute gained was of inestimable value, because Bernard would make use of it on his side to take action against the 6th man, the sentry outside the tunnel, and to make his escape with Prince Conrad. Perhaps that man would come as well, or else perhaps Bernard would get rid of him without using his revolver, and therefore without attracting attention. And Paul, gradually raising his voice, was spluttering out vague explanations, which only irritated without enlightening the corporal, when a shot rang out, followed by 2 others. For the moment the corporal hesitated, not knowing for certain where the sound came from. The men stood away from Paul and listened. Thereupon he passed through them and walked straight on, without their realizing in the darkness that it was he who was moving away. Then, at the first turn, he started running and reached the shed in a few strides. 20 yards in front of him, at the mouth of the tunnel, he saw Bernard struggling with Prince Conrad, who was trying to escape. Near them, the sentry was dragging himself along the ground and moaning. Paul saw clearly what he had to do. To lend Bernard a hand and with him attempt to run the risk of flight would have been madness, because their enemies would inevitably have caught them up, and in any case Prince Conrad would have been set free. No, the essential thing was to stop the rush of the 5 other men, whose shadows were already appearing at the bend in the road, and thus enable Bernard to get away with the prince. Half hidden behind the shed, he aimed his revolver at them and cried, "Halt!" The corporal did not obey and ran on into the belt of light. Paul fired. The German fell, but only wounded, for he began to command in a savage tone, "Forward! Go for him! Forward, can't you, you funks!" The men did not stir a step. Paul seized a rifle from the stack which they had made of theirs near the shed, and, while taking aim at them, was able to give a glance backwards and to see that Bernard had at last mastered Prince Conrad and was leading him well into the tunnel. "It's only a question of holding out for 5 minutes," thought Paul, "so that Bernard may go as far as possible." And he was so calm at this moment that he could have counted those minutes by the steady beating of his pulse. "Forward! Rush at him! Forward!" the corporal kept clamoring, having doubtless seen the figures of the 2 fugitives, though without recognizing Prince Conrad. Rising to his knees, he fired a revolver shot at Paul, who replied by breaking his arm with a bullet. And yet the corporal went on shouting at the top of his voice, "Forward! There are 2 of them making off through the tunnel! Forward! Here comes help!" It was half a dozen soldiers from the barracks who had run up at the sound of the shooting. Paul had now made his way into the shed. He broke a window pane and fired 3 shots. The soldiers made for shelter, but others arrived, took their orders from the corporal and dispersed, and Paul saw them scrambling up the adjoining slopes in order to head him off. He fired his rifle a few more times, but what was the good? All hope of resistance had long since disappeared. He persevered, however, killing his adversaries at intervals, firing incessantly, and thus gaining all the time possible. But he saw that the enemy was manoeuvring with the object of first circumventing him, and then making for the tunnel and chasing the fugitives. Paul set his teeth. He was really aware of each second that passed, of each of those inappreciable seconds which increased Bernard's distance. 3 men disappeared down the yawning mouth of the tunnel, then a 4th, then a 5th. Moreover, the bullets were now beginning to rain upon the shed. Paul made a calculation. Bernard must be 600 or 700 yards away. The 3 men pursuing him have gone 50 yards, 75 yards now. That's all right. A serried mass of Germans were coming towards the shed. It was evidently not believed that Paul was alone, so quickly did he fire. This time there was nothing for it but to surrender. "It's time," he thought. "Bernard is outside the danger zone." He suddenly rushed at the board containing the handles which corresponded with the mine chambers in the tunnel, smashed the glass with the butt end of his rifle, and pulled down the first handle and the second. The earth seemed to shake. A thunderous roar rolled under the tunnel and spread far and long, like a reverberating echo. The way was blocked between Bernard d'Andeville and the eager pack that was trying to catch him. Bernard could take Prince Conrad quietly to France. Then Paul walked out of the shed, raising his arms in the air and crying in a cheerful voice, "Camarade! Camarade!" 10 men surrounded him in a moment, and the officer who commanded them shouted in a frenzy of rage, "Let him be shot at once, at once! Let him be shot!" End of chapter 16. Chapter 17 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 17. The Law of the Conqueror. Brutally handled though he was, Paul offered no resistance, and while they were pushing him with needless violence towards the perpendicular part of the cliff, he continued his inner calculations. It is mathematically certain that the 2 explosions took place at distances of 300 and 400 yards respectively. I can therefore also take it as certain that Bernard and Prince Conrad were on the far side and that the men in pursuit were on this side. So all is for the best. Docilely and with a sort of chaffing complacency he submitted to the preparations for his execution. The 12 soldiers entrusted with it were already drawn up in line under the bright rays of an electric searchlight, and were only waiting for the order. The corporal whom he had wounded early in the fight dragged himself up to him and snarled, "Shot! You're going to be shot, you dirty Franzose!" He answered with a laugh, "Not a bit of it. Things don't happen as quickly as all that." "Shot," repeated the other. "Herr Leutnant said so." "Well, what's he waiting for, your Herr Leutnant?" The lieutenant was making a rapid investigation at the entrance to the tunnel. The men who had gone down it came running back, half asphyxiated by the fumes of the explosion. As for the sentry, whom Bernard had been forced to get rid of, he was losing blood so profusely that it was no use trying to obtain any fresh information from him. At that moment news arrived from the barracks where they had just learnt, through a courier sent from the villa, that Prince Conrad had disappeared. The officers were ordered to double the guard and to keep a good lookout, especially at the approaches. Of course Paul had counted on this diversion or some other of the same kind which would delay his execution. The day was beginning to break, and he had little doubt that, Prince Conrad having been left dead drunk in his bedroom, one of his servants had been told to keep a watch on him. Finding the doors locked, the man must have given the alarm. This would lead to an immediate search. But what surprised Paul was that no one suspected that the prince had been carried off through the tunnel. The sentry was lying unconscious and was unable to speak. The men had not realized that, of the two fugitives seen at a distance, one was dragging the other along. In short, it was thought that the prince had been assassinated. His murderers must have flung his body into some corner of the quarries and then taken to flight. Two of them had succeeded in escaping. The third was a prisoner. And nobody for a second entertained the least suspicion of an enterprise whose audacity simply surpassed imagination. In any case, there could no longer be any question of shooting Paul without a preliminary inquiry, the results of which must first be communicated to the highest authorities. He was taken to the villa, where he was divested of his German overcoat, carefully searched, and lastly was locked up in a bedroom under the protection of 4 stalwart soldiers. He spent several hours in dozing, glad of this rest, which he needed so badly, and feeling very easy in his mind, because now that Karl was dead, the Comtesse Hermine absent, and Elizabeth in a place of safety, there was nothing for him to do but to await the normal course of events. At 10 o'clock he was visited by a general who endeavoured to question him, and who, receiving no satisfactory replies, grew angry, but with a certain reserve, in which Paul observed the sort of respect which people feel for noted criminals. And he said to himself, "Everything is going as it should. This visit is only a preliminary to prepare me for the coming of a more serious ambassador, a sort of plenipotentiary." He gathered from the general's words that they were still looking for the prince's body. They were now in fact looking for it beyond the immediate precincts, for a new clue, provided by the discovery and the revelations of the chauffeur whom Paul and Bernard had imprisoned in the garage, as well as by the departure and return of the motor car, as reported by the sentries, widened the field of investigation considerably. At 12 o'clock Paul was provided with a substantial meal. The attention shown to him increased. Beer was served with the lunch, and afterwards coffee. "I shall perhaps be shot," he thought, "but with due formality, and not before they know exactly who the mysterious person is whom they have the honour of shooting, not to mention the motives of his enterprise and the results obtained. Now I alone am able to supply the details. Consequently..." He so clearly felt the strength of his position and the necessity in which his enemies stood to contribute to the success of his plan, that he was not surprised at being taken, an hour later, to a small drawing-room in the villa, before 2 persons all over gold lace, who first had him searched once more, and then saw that he was fastened up with more elaborate care than ever. It must, he thought, be at least the Imperial Chancellor coming all the way from Berlin to see me. Unless, indeed... Deep down within himself, in view of the circumstances, he could not help foreseeing an even more powerful intervention than the Chancellor's; and when he heard a motor car stop under the windows of the villa, and saw the fluster of the 2 gold-laced individuals, he was convinced that his anticipations were being fully confirmed. Everything was ready. Even before anyone appeared, the 2 individuals drew themselves up and stood to attention, and the soldiers, stiffer still, looked like dolls out of a Noah's Ark. The door opened, and a whirlwind entrance took place, amid a jingling of spurs and sabre. The man who arrived in this fashion at once gave an impression of feverish haste and of imminent departure. What he intended to do he must accomplish within the space of a few minutes. At a sign from him, all those present quitted the room. The Emperor and the French officer were left face to face, and the Emperor immediately asked in an angry voice, "Who are you? What did you come to do? Who are your accomplices? By whose orders were you acting?" It was difficult to recognize in him the figure represented by his photographs and the illustrations in the newspapers, for the face had aged into a worn and wasted mask, furrowed with wrinkles and disfigured with yellow blotches. Paul was quivering with hatred, not so much a personal hatred aroused by the recollections of his own sufferings, as a hatred made up of horror and contempt for the greatest criminal imaginable. And despite his resolve not to depart from the usual formulas and the rules of outward respect, he answered, "Let them untie me." The Emperor started. It was the first time certainly that anyone had spoken to him like that, and he exclaimed, "Why, you're forgetting that a word will be enough to have you shot. And you dare! Conditions!" Paul remained silent. The Emperor strode up and down with his hand on the hilt of his sword, which he dragged along the carpet. Twice he stopped and looked at Paul, and when Paul did not move an eyelid, he resumed his march with an increasing display of indignation. And all of a sudden he pressed the button of an electric bell. "Untie him," he said to the men who hurried into the room. When released from his bonds, Paul rose up and stood like a soldier in the presence of his superior officer. The room was emptied once again. Then the Emperor went up to Paul and, leaving a table as a barrier between them, asked, still in a harsh voice, "Prince Conrad?" Paul answered, "Prince Conrad is not dead, sir. He is well." "Ah," said the Emperor, evidently relieved. And, still reluctant to come to the point, he continued, "That does not affect matters in so far as you are concerned. Assault, espionage, not to speak of the murder of one of my best servants." "Karl the spy, sir? I killed him in self-defense." "But you did kill him. Then for that murder and for the rest you shall be shot." "No, sir. Prince Conrad's life is security for mine." The Emperor shrugged his shoulders. "If Prince Conrad is alive, he will be found." "No, sir, he will not be found." "There is not a place in Germany where my searching will fail to find him," he declared, striking the table with his fist. "Prince Conrad is not in Germany, sir." "Eh? What's that? Then where is he?" "In France." "In France?" "Yes, sir, in France, at the Château d'Ornequin, in the custody of my friends. If I am not back with them by 6 o'clock tomorrow evening, Prince Conrad will be handed over to the military authorities." The Emperor seemed to be choking, so much so that his anger suddenly collapsed and that he did not even seek to conceal the violence of the blow. All the humiliation, all the ridicule that would fall upon him and upon his dynasty and upon the empire if his son were a prisoner, the loud laughter that would ring through the whole world at the news, the assurance which the possession of such a hostage would give to the enemy, all this showed in his anxious look and in the stoop of his shoulders. Paul felt the thrill of victory. He held that man as firmly as you hold under your knee the beaten foe who cries out for mercy. And the balance of the forces in conflict was so definitely broken in his favor that the Kaiser's very eyes, raised to Paul's, gave him a sense of his triumph. The Emperor was able to picture the various phases of the drama enacted during the previous night: the arrival through the tunnel, the kidnapping by the way of the tunnel, the exploding of the mines to ensure the flight of the assailants, and the mad daring of the adventure staggered him. He murmured, "Who are you?" Paul relaxed slightly from his rigid attitude. He placed a quivering hand upon the table between them and said in a grave tone, "16 years ago, sir, in the late afternoon of a September day, you inspected the works of the tunnel which you were building from Èbrecourt to Corvigny under the guidance of a person, how shall I describe her, of a person highly placed in your secret service. At the moment when you were leaving a little chapel which stands in the Ornequin woods, you met two Frenchmen, a father and son. You remember, sir? It was raining, and the meeting was so disagreeable to you that you allowed a gesture of annoyance to escape you. 10 minutes later, the lady who accompanied you returned and tried to take one of the Frenchmen, the father, back with her to German territory, alleging as a pretext that you wished to speak to him. The Frenchman refused. The woman murdered him before his son's eyes. His name was Delroze. He was my father." The Kaiser had listened with increasing astonishment. It seemed to Paul that his color had become more jaundiced than ever. Nevertheless, he kept his countenance under Paul's gaze. To him the death of that Monsieur Delroze was one of those minor incidents over which an emperor does not waste time. Did he so much as remember it? He therefore declined to enter into the details of a crime which he had certainly not ordered, though his indulgence for the criminal had made him a party to it, and he contented himself, after a pause, with observing, "The Comtesse Hermine is responsible for her own actions." "And responsible only to herself," Paul retorted, "seeing that the police of her country refuse to let her be called to account for this one." The Emperor shrugged his shoulders with the air of a man who scorns to discuss questions of German morality and higher politics. He looked at his watch, rang the bell, gave notice that he would be ready to leave in a few minutes, and turning to Paul said, "So it was to avenge your father's death that you carried off Prince Conrad?" "No, sir, that is a question between the Comtesse Hermine and me. But with Prince Conrad I have another matter to settle. When Prince Conrad was staying at the Château d'Ornequin, he pestered with his attentions a lady living in the house. Finding himself rebuffed by her, he brought her here to his villa as a prisoner. The lady bears my name, and I came to fetch her." It was evident from the Emperor's attitude that he knew nothing of the story, and that his son's pranks were a great source of worry to him. "Are you sure?" he asked. "Is the lady here?" "She was here last night, sir, but the Comtesse Hermine resolved to do away with her and gave her into the charge of Karl the spy, with instructions to take her out of Prince Conrad's reach and poison her." "That's a lie!" cried the Emperor. "A damnable lie!" "There is the bottle which the Comtesse Hermine handed to Karl the spy." "And then? And then?" said the Kaiser in an angry voice. "Then, sir, as Karl the spy was dead, and as I did not know the place to which my wife had been taken, I came back here. Prince Conrad was asleep. With the aid of one of my friends, I brought him down from his room and sent him into France through the tunnel." "And I suppose, in return for his liberty, you want the liberty of your wife?" "Yes, sir." "But I don't know where she is," exclaimed the Emperor. "She is in a country house belonging to the Comtesse Hermine. Perhaps, if you would just think, sir, a country house a few hours off by motor car, say 100 or 120 miles at most." The Emperor, without speaking, kept tapping the table angrily with the pommel of his sword. Then he said, "Is that all you ask?" "No, sir." "What? You want something more?" "Yes, sir, the release of 20 French prisoners whose names appear on a list given me by the French commander-in-chief." This time the Emperor sprang to his feet with a bound. "You're mad! 20 prisoners? And officers, I expect. Commanders of army corps? Generals?" "The list also contains the names of privates, sir." The Emperor refused to listen. His fury found expression in wild gestures and incoherent words. His eyes shot terrible glances at Paul. The idea of taking his orders from that little French subaltern, himself a captive and yet in a position to lay down the law, must have been fearfully unpleasant. Instead of punishing his insolent enemy, he had to argue with him and to bow his head before his outrageous proposals. But he had no choice. There was no means of escape. He had as his adversary one whom not even torture would have caused to yield. And Paul continued, "Sir, my wife's liberty against Prince Conrad's liberty would not really be a fair bargain. What do you care, sir, whether my wife is a prisoner or free? No, it is only reasonable that Prince Conrad's release should be the object of an exchange which justifies it. And 20 French prisoners are none too many. Besides, there is no need for this to be done publicly. The prisoners can come back to France, one by one, if you prefer, as though in exchange for German prisoners of the same rank. So that—" The irony of these conciliatory words, intended to soften the bitterness of defeat and to conceal the blow struck at the imperial pride under the guise of a concession. Paul thoroughly relished those few minutes. He received the impression that this man, upon whom a comparatively slight injury to his self-respect inflicted so great a torment, must be suffering more seriously still at seeing his gigantic scheme come to nothing under the formidable onslaught of destiny. "I am nicely revenged," thought Paul to himself, "and this is only the beginning." The capitulation was at hand. The Emperor declared, "I shall see. "I will give orders." Paul protested. "It would be dangerous to wait, sir. Prince Conrad's capture might become known in France." "Well," said the Emperor, "bring Prince Conrad back and your wife shall be restored to you the same day." But Paul was pitiless. He insisted on being treated with entire confidence. "No, sir," he said, "I do not think that things can happen just like that. My wife is in a most horrible position, and her very life is at stake. I must ask to be taken to her at once. She and I will be in France this evening. It is imperative that we should be in France this evening." He repeated the words in a very firm tone, and added, "As for the French prisoners, sir, they can be returned under such conditions as you may be pleased to state. I will give you a list of their names with the places at which they are interned." Paul took a pencil and a sheet of paper. When he had finished writing, the Emperor snatched the list from him, and his face immediately became convulsed. At each name he seemed to shake with impotent rage. He crumpled the paper into a ball, as though he had resolved to break off the whole arrangement. But all of a sudden, abandoning his resistance, with a hurried movement, as though feverishly determined to have done with an exasperating business, he rang the bell 3 times. An orderly officer entered with a brisk step and brought his heels together before the Kaiser. The Emperor reflected a few seconds longer. Then he gave his commands. "Take Lieutenant Delroze in a motor car to Schloss Hildensheim and bring him back with his wife to the Èbrecourt outposts. On this day week, meet him at the same point on our lines. He will be accompanied by Prince Conrad and you by the 20 French prisoners whose names are on this list. You will effect the exchange in a discreet manner, which you will fix upon with Lieutenant Delroze. That will do. Keep me informed by personal reports." This was uttered in a jerky, authoritative tone, as though it were a series of measures which the Emperor had adopted of his own initiative, without undergoing pressure of any kind, and by the mere exercise of his imperial will. And, having thus settled the matter, he walked out, carrying his head high, swaggering with his sword and jingling his spurs. One more victory to his credit. What a play actor, thought Paul, who could not help laughing, to the officer's great horror. He heard the Emperor's motor drive away. The interview had lasted hardly 10 minutes. A moment later he himself was outside, hastening along the road to Hildensheim. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 18, Hill 132. What a ride it was, and how gay Paul Delroze felt! He was at last attaining his object, and this time it was not one of those hazardous enterprises which so often end in cruel disappointment, but the logical outcome and reward of his efforts. He was beyond the reach of the least shade of anxiety. There are victories, and his recent victory over the Emperor was one of them, which involve the disappearance of every obstacle. Elizabeth was at Hildensheim Castle, and he was on his way to the castle, and nothing would stop him. He seemed to recognize by the daylight features in the landscape which had been hidden from him by the darkness of the night before. A hamlet here, a village there, a river which he had skirted. He saw the string of the little roadside woods, and he saw the ditch by which he had fought with Karl the spy. It took hardly more than another hour to reach the hill which was topped by the feudal fortress of Hildensheim. It was surrounded by a wide moat, spanned by a drawbridge. A suspicious porter made his appearance, but a few words from the officer caused the doors to be flung open. 2 footmen hurried down from the castle, and in reply to Paul's question, said that the French lady was walking near the pond. He asked the way, and said to the officer, "I shall go alone. We shall start very soon." It had been raining. A pale winter sun, stealing through the heavy clouds, lit up the lawns and shrubberies. Paul went along a row of hothouses and climbed an artificial rockery, whence trickled the thin stream of a waterfall, which formed a large pool set in a frame of dark fir trees and alive with swans and wild duck. At the end of the pool was a terrace adorned with statues and stone benches, and there he saw Élisabeth. Paul underwent an indescribable emotion. He had not spoken to his wife since the outbreak of war. Since that day Élisabeth had suffered the most horrible trials, and had suffered them for the simple reason that she wished to appear in her husband's eyes as a blameless wife, the daughter of a blameless mother. And now he was about to meet her again at a time when none of the accusations which he had brought against the Comtesse Hermine could be rebuffed, and when Élisabeth herself had roused Paul to such a pitch of indignation by her presence at Prince Conrad's supper party. But how long ago it all seemed, and how little it mattered! Prince Conrad's blackguardism, the Comtesse Hermine's crimes, the ties of relationship which might unite the two women, all the struggles which Paul had passed through, all his anguish, all his rebelliousness, all his loathing, were but so many insignificant details, now that he saw at 20 paces from him his unhappy darling, whom he loved so well. He no longer thought of the tears which she had shed, and saw nothing but her wasted figure shivering in the wintry wind. He walked towards her. His steps grated on the gravel path, and Élisabeth turned round. She did not make a single gesture. He understood from the expression of her face that she did not see him really, that she looked upon him as a phantom rising from the mists of dreams, and that this phantom must often float before her deluded eyes. She even smiled at him a little, such a sad smile that Paul clasped his hands and was nearly falling on his knees. "Élisabeth, Élisabeth," he stammered. Then she drew herself up and put her hand to her heart and turned even paler than she had been the evening before, seated between Prince Conrad and Comtesse Hermine. The image was emerging from the realm of mist. The reality grew plainer before her eyes and in her brain. This time she saw Paul. He ran towards her, for she seemed on the point of falling. But she recovered herself, put out her hands to make him stay where he was, and looked at him with such an effort as though she would have penetrated to the very depths of his soul to read his thoughts. Paul, trembling with love from head to foot, did not stir. She murmured, "Ah, I see that you love me, that you have never ceased to love me. I am sure of it now." She kept her arms outstretched, however, as though against an obstacle, and he himself did not attempt to come closer. All their life and all their happiness lay in their eyes. And while her gaze wildly encountered his, she went on, "They told me that you were a prisoner. Is it true, then? Oh, how I have implored them to take me to you! How low I have stooped! I have even had to sit down at table with them and laugh at their jokes and wear jewels and pearl necklaces which he has forced upon me. All this in order to see you. And they kept on promising. And then, at length, they brought me here last night, and I thought that they had tricked me once more, or else it was a fresh trap, or that they had at last made up their minds to kill me. And now here you are, Paul, my own darling." She took his face in her two hands, and suddenly, in a voice of despair, "But you're not going just yet. You will stay till tomorrow, surely. They can't take you from me like that, after a few minutes. You're staying, are you not? Oh, Paul, all my courage is gone. Don't leave me." She was greatly surprised to see him smile. "What's the matter? Why, my dearest, how happy you look!" He began to laugh, and this time, drawing her to him with a masterful air that admitted of no denial, he kissed her hair and her forehead and her cheeks and her lips. And he said, "I am laughing because there is nothing to do but to laugh and to kiss you. I am laughing also because I have been imagining so many silly things. Yes, just think, at that supper last night I saw you from a distance, and I suffered agonies. I accused you of I don't know what. Oh, what a fool I was!" She could not understand his gaiety, and she said again, "How happy you are! How can you be so happy?" "There is no reason why I should not be," said Paul, still laughing. "Come, look at things as they are. You and I are meeting after unheard of misfortunes. We are together. Nothing can separate us. And you wouldn't have me be glad?" "Do you mean to say that nothing can separate us?" she asked, in a voice quivering with anxiety. "Why, of course. Is that so strange?" "You are staying with me? Are we to live here?" "No, not that. What an idea! You're going to pack up your things at express speed, and we shall be off." "Where to?" "Where to? To France, of course. When you think of it, that's the only country where one's really comfortable." And when she stared at him in amazement, he said: "Come, let's hurry. The car's waiting, and I promised Bernard, yes, your brother Bernard, that we should be with him tonight. Are you ready? But why that astounded look? Do you want to have things explained to you? But, my very dearest, it will take hours and hours to explain everything that's happened to yourself and me. You've turned the head of an imperial prince, and then you were shot, and then. Oh, what does it all matter? Must I force you to come away with me?" All at once she understood that he was speaking seriously, and without taking her eyes from him, she asked: "Is it true? Are we free?" "Absolutely free." "We're going back to France?" "Immediately." "We have nothing more to fear?" "Nothing." The tension from which she was suffering suddenly relaxed. She in her turn began to laugh, yielding to one of those fits of uncontrollable mirth which find vent in every sort of childish nonsense. She could have sung, she could have danced for sheer joy. And yet the tears flowed down her cheeks, and she stammered: "Free! It's all over. Have I been through much? Not at all. Oh, you know that I had been shot? Well, I assure you it wasn't so bad as all that. I will tell you about it and lots of other things. And you must tell me too. But how did you manage? You must be cleverer than the cleverest, cleverer than the unspeakable Conrad, cleverer than the Emperor. Oh, dear, how funny it is! How funny!" She broke off and, seizing him forcibly by the arm, said: "Let us go, darling. It's madness to remain another second. These people are capable of anything. They look upon no promise as binding. They are scoundrels, criminals. Let's go, let's go." They went away. Their journey was uneventful. In the evening they reached the lines on the front facing Èbrecourt. The officer on duty, who had full powers, had a reflector lit and himself, after ordering a white flag to be displayed, took Élisabeth and Paul to the French officer, who came forward. The officer telephoned to the rear. A motor car was sent, and at 9 o'clock Paul and Élisabeth pulled up at the gates of Ornequin, and Paul asked to have Bernard sent for. He met him halfway. "Is that you, Bernard?" he said. "Listen to me and don't let us waste a minute. I have brought back Élisabeth. Yes, she's here, in the car. We are off to Corvigny and you're coming with us. While I go for my bag and yours, you give instructions to have Prince Conrad closely watched. He's safe, isn't he?" "Yes." "Then hurry. I want to get at the woman whom you saw last night as she was entering the tunnel. Now that she's in France, we'll hunt her down." "Don't you think, Paul, that we should be more likely to find her tracks by ourselves, going back into the tunnel and searching the place where it opens at Corvigny?" "We can't afford the time. We have arrived at a phase of the struggle that demands the utmost haste." "But, Paul, the struggle is over now that Élisabeth is saved." "The struggle will never be over as long as that woman lives." "Well, but who is she?" Paul did not answer. At 10 o'clock they all three alighted outside the station at Corvigny. There were no more trains. Everybody was asleep. Paul refused to be put off, went to the military guard, woke up the adjutant, sent for the station master, sent for the booking clerk, and, after a minute inquiry, succeeded in establishing the fact that on the same Monday morning a woman supplied with a pass in the name of Madame Antonon had taken a ticket for Château Thierry. She was the only woman travelling alone. She was wearing a Red Cross uniform. Her description corresponded at all points with that of the Comtesse Hermine. "It's certainly she," said Paul, when they had taken their rooms for the night at the hotel near the station. "There's no doubt about it. It's the only way she could go from Corvigny, and it's the way that we shall go to-morrow morning, at the same time that she did. I hope that she will not have time to carry out the scheme that has brought her to France. In any case, this is a great opportunity, and we must make the most of it." "But who is the woman?" Bernard asked again. "Who is she? Ask Élisabeth to tell you. We have an hour left in which to discuss certain details, and then we must go to bed. We need rest, all three of us." They started on the Tuesday morning. Paul's confidence was unshaken. Though he knew nothing of the Comtesse Hermine's intentions, he felt sure that he was on the right road. And, in fact, they were told several times that a Red Cross nurse, travelling first class and alone, had passed through the same stations on the day before. They got out at Château Thierry late in the afternoon. Paul made his inquiries. On the previous evening the nurse had driven away in a Red Cross motor car which was waiting at the station. This car, according to the papers carried by the driver, belonged to one of the ambulances working to the rear of Soissons, but the exact position of the ambulance was not known. This was near enough for Paul, however. Soissons was in the battle line. "Let's go to Soissons," he said. The order signed by the commander in chief, which he had on him, gave him full power to requisition a motor car and to enter the fighting zone. They reached Soissons at dinner time. The outskirts, ruined by the bombardment, were deserted. The town itself seemed abandoned for the greater part, but as they came nearer to the centre a certain animation prevailed in the streets. Companies of soldiers passed at a quick pace. Guns and ammunition wagons trotted by. In the hotel to which they went on the Grande Place, a hotel containing a number of officers, there was general excitement, with much coming and going and even a little disorder. Paul and Bernard asked the reason. They were told that, for some days past, we had been successfully attacking the slopes opposite Soissons, on the other side of the Aisne. 2 days before, some battalions of light infantry and African troops had taken Hill 132 by assault. On the following day, we held the positions which we had won and carried the trenches on the Dent de Cuy. Then, in the course of the Monday night, at a time when the enemy was delivering a violent counter-attack, a curious thing happened. The Aisne, which was swollen as a result of the heavy rains, overflowed its banks and carried away all the bridges at Villeneuve and Soissons. The rise of the Aisne was natural enough, but high though the river was, it did not explain the destruction of the bridges, and this destruction, coinciding with the German counter-attack and apparently due to suspect reasons which had not yet been cleared up, had complicated the position of the French troops by making the dispatch of reinforcements almost impossible. Our men had held the hill all day, but with difficulty and with great losses. At this moment, a part of the artillery was being moved back to the right bank of the Aisne. Paul and Bernard did not hesitate in their minds for a second. In all this they recognized the Comtesse Hermine's handiwork. The destruction of the bridges, the German attacks, those two incidents which happened on the very night of her arrival were, beyond a doubt, the outcome of a plan conceived by her, the execution of which had been prepared for the time when the rains were bound to swell the river, and proved the collaboration existing between the Countess and the enemy's staff. Besides, Paul remembered the sentences which she had exchanged with Karl the spy outside the door of Prince Conrad's villa. "I am going to France. Everything is ready. The weather is in our favor. And the staff have told me. So I shall be there to-morrow evening, and it will need only a touch of the thumb." She had given that touch of the thumb. All the bridges had been tampered with by Karl or by men in his pay, and had now broken down. "It's she, obviously enough," said Bernard. "And if it is, why look so anxious? You ought to be glad, on the contrary, because we are now positively certain of laying hold of her." "Yes, but shall we do so in time? When she spoke to Karl, she uttered another threat which struck me as much more serious. As I told you, she said, 'Luck is turning against us. If I succeed, it will be the end of the run on the Black.' and when the spy asked her if she had the Emperor's consent, she answered that it was unnecessary, and that this was one of the undertakings which one doesn't talk about. You understand, Bernard, it's not a question of the German attack or the destruction of the bridges. That is honest warfare, and the Emperor knows all about it. No, it's a question of something different, which is intended to coincide with other events and give them their full significance. The woman can't think that an advance of half a mile or a mile is an incident capable of ending what she calls the run on the black. Then what is at the back of it all? I don't know, and that accounts for my anxiety." Paul spent the whole of that evening and the whole of the next day, Wednesday the 13th, in making prolonged searches in the streets of the town or along the banks of the Aisne. He had placed himself in communication with the military authorities. Officers and men took part in his investigations. They went over several houses and questioned a number of the inhabitants. Bernard offered to go with him, but Paul persisted in refusing. "No, it is true, the woman doesn't know you, but she must not see your sister. I am asking you therefore to stay with Élisabeth, to keep her from going out, and to watch over her without a moment's intermission, for we have to do with the most terrible enemy imaginable." The brother and sister therefore passed the long hours of that day with their faces glued to the window panes. Paul came back at intervals to snatch a meal. He was quivering with hope. "She's here," he said. "She must have left those who were with her in the motor car, dropped her nurse's disguise, and is now hiding in some hole like a spider behind its web. I can see her, telephone in hand, giving her orders to a whole band of people who have taken to earth like herself and made themselves invisible like her. But I am beginning to perceive her plan, and I have one advantage over her, which is that she believes herself in safety. She does not know that her accomplice Karl is dead. She does not know of Élisabeth's release. She does not know of our presence here. I've got her, the loathsome beast, I've got her." The news of the battle, meanwhile, was not improving. The retreating movement on the left bank continued. At Crouy, the severity of their losses and the depth of the mud stopped the rush of the Moroccan troops. A hurriedly constructed pontoon bridge went drifting downstream. When Paul made his next appearance at 6 o'clock in the evening, there were a few drops of blood on his sleeve. Élisabeth took alarm. "It's nothing," he said with a laugh, "a scratch. I don't know how I got it." "But your hand, look at your hand, you're bleeding." "No, it's not my blood. Don't be frightened. Everything's all right." Bernard said, "You know the Commander-in-Chief came to Soissons this morning." "Yes, so it seems. All the better. I should like to make him a present of the spy and her gang. It would be a handsome gift." He went away for another hour and then came back and had dinner. "You look as though you were sure of things now," said Bernard. "One can never be sure of anything. That woman is the very devil." "But you know where she's hiding?" "Yes." "And what are you waiting for?" "I'm waiting for 9 o'clock. I shall take a rest till then. Wake me up at a little before 9." The guns never ceased booming in the distant darkness. Sometimes a shell would fall on the town with a great crash. Troops passed in every direction. Then there would be brief intervals of silence in which the sounds of war seemed to hang in suspense. And it was those minutes which perhaps were most formidable and significant. Paul woke of himself. He said to his wife and Bernard, "You know you're coming too. It will be rough work, Élisabeth, very rough work. Are you certain that you're equal to it?" "Oh, Paul, but you yourself are looking so pale." "Yes," he said, "it's the excitement. Not because of what is going to happen, but in spite of all my precautions, I shall be afraid until the last moment that the adversary will escape. A single act of carelessness, a stroke of ill luck, that gives the alarm, and I shall have to begin all over again. Never mind about your revolver, Bernard." "What?" cried Bernard. "Isn't there going to be any fighting in this expedition of yours?" Paul did not reply. According to his custom, he expressed himself during or after action. Bernard took his revolver. The last stroke of 9 sounded as they crossed the Grande Place, amid a darkness stabbed here and there by a thin ray of light issuing from a closed shop. A group of soldiers were massed in the forecourt of the cathedral, whose shadowy bulk they felt looming overhead. Paul flashed the light from an electric lamp upon them and asked the one in command, "Any news, Sergeant?" "No, sir. No one has entered the house and no one has gone out." The sergeant gave a low whistle. In the middle of the street 2 men emerged from the surrounding gloom and approached the group. "Any sound in the house?" "No, Sergeant." "Any light behind the shutters?" "No, Sergeant." Then Paul marched ahead and, while the others, in obedience to his instructions, followed him without making the least noise, he stepped on resolutely, like a belated wayfarer making for home. They stopped at a narrow-fronted house, the ground floor of which was hardly distinguishable in the darkness of the night. 3 steps led to the door. Paul gave 4 sharp taps and, at the same time, took a key from his pocket and opened the door. He switched on his electric lamp again in the passage and, while his companions continued as silent as before, turned to a mirror which rose straight from the flagged floor. He gave 4 little taps on the mirror and then pushed it, pressing one side of it. It masked the aperture of a staircase which led to the basement, and Paul sent the light of his lantern down the well. This appeared to be a signal, the 3rd signal agreed upon, for a voice from below, a woman's voice, but hoarse and rasping in its tones, asked, "Is that you, Daddy Walter?" The moment had come to act. Without answering, Paul rushed down the stairs, taking 4 steps at a time. He reached the bottom just as a massive door was closing, almost barring his access to the cellar. He gave a strong push and entered. The Comtesse Hermine was there in the semi-darkness, motionless, hesitating what to do. Then suddenly she ran to the other end of the cellar, seized a revolver on the table, turned round and fired. The hammer clicked, but there was no report. She repeated the action 3 times, and the result was 3 times the same. "It's no use going on," said Paul with a laugh. "The charge has been removed." The Countess uttered a cry of rage, opened the drawer of the table, and taking another revolver, pulled the trigger 4 times without producing a sound. "You may as well drop it," laughed Paul. "This one has been emptied too, and so is the one in the other drawer. So have all the firearms in the house, for that matter." Then, when she stared at him in amazement, without understanding, dazed by her own helplessness, he bowed and introduced himself, just in 2 words, which meant so much. Paul Delroze. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 19. Hohenzollern. The cellar, though smaller, looked like one of those large vaulted basement halls which prevail in the Champagne district. Walls spotlessly clean, a smooth floor with brick paths running across it, a warm atmosphere, a curtained-off recess between 2 wine vats, chairs, benches, and rugs. All went to form not only a comfortable abode, out of the way of the shells, but also a safe refuge for anyone who stood in fear of indiscreet visits. Paul remembered the ruins of the old lighthouse on the bank of the Yser and the tunnel from Ornequin to Èbrecourt. So the struggle was still continuing underground, a war of trenches and cellars, a war of spying and trickery, the same unvarying, stealthy, disgraceful, suspicious, criminal methods. Paul had put out his lantern, and the room was now only dimly lit by an oil lamp hanging from the ceiling, whose rays, thrown downward by an opaque shade, cast a white circle in which the 2 of them stood by themselves. Élisabeth and Bernard remained in the background, in the shadow. The sergeant and his men had not appeared, but they could be heard at the foot of the stairs. The Countess did not move. She was dressed as on the evening of the supper at Prince Conrad's villa. Her face showed no longer any fear or alarm, but rather an effort of thought, as though she were trying to calculate all the consequences of the position now revealed to her. Paul Delroze? With what object was he attacking her? His intention, and this was evidently the idea that gradually caused the Comtesse Hermine's features to relax, his intention, no doubt, was to procure his wife's liberty. She smiled. Elizabeth a prisoner in Germany! What a trump card for herself, caught in a trap, but still able to command events. At a sign from Paul, Bernard stepped forward, and Paul said to the Countess, "My brother-in-law." Major Hermann, when he lay trussed up in the ferryman's house, may have seen him, just as he may have seen me. But in any case the Comtesse Hermine, or to be more exact, the Comtesse d'Andeville, does not know, or at least has forgotten, her son, Bernard d'Andeville. She now seemed quite reassured, still wearing the air of one fighting with equal or even more powerful weapons. She displayed no confusion at the sight of Bernard, and said in a careless tone, "Bernard d'Andeville is very like his sister Elizabeth, of whom circumstances have allowed me to see a great deal lately. It is only 3 days since she and I were having supper with Prince Conrad. The Prince is very fond of Elizabeth, and he is quite right, for she is charming, and so amiable." Paul and Bernard both made the same movement, which would have ended in their flinging themselves upon the Countess, if they had not succeeded in restraining their hatred. Paul pushed aside his brother-in-law, of whose intense anger he was conscious, and replied to his adversary's challenge in an equally casual tone. "Yes, I know all about it. I was there. I was even present at her departure. Your friend Karl offered me a seat in his car, and we went off to your place at Hildensheim, a very handsome castle which I should have liked to see more thoroughly. But it is not a safe house to stay at. In fact, it is often deadly, and so—" The Countess looked at him with increasing disquiet. What did he mean to convey? How did he know these things? She resolved to frighten him in his turn, so as to gain some idea of the enemy's plans, and she said in a hard voice, "Yes, deadly is the word. The air there is not good for everybody." "A poisonous air." "Just so." "Are you nervous about Elizabeth?" "Frankly, yes. The poor thing's health is none of the best, as it is, and I shall not be easy—" "Until she's dead, I suppose." She waited a second or two, and then retorted, speaking very clearly, so that Paul might take in the meaning of her words, "Yes, until she is dead. And that can't be far off, if it has not happened already." There was a pause of some length. Once more, in the presence of that woman, Paul felt the same craving to commit murder, the same craving to gratify his hatred. She must be killed. It was his duty to kill her. It was a crime not to obey that duty. Elizabeth was standing 3 paces back in the dark. Slowly, without a word, Paul turned in her direction, pressed the spring of his lantern, and flashed the light full on his wife's face. Not for a moment did he suspect the violent effect which his action would have on the Comtesse Hermine. A woman like her was incapable of making a mistake, of thinking herself the victim of an hallucination or the dupe of a resemblance. No, she at once accepted the fact that Paul had delivered his wife and that Elizabeth was standing in front of her. But how was so disastrous an event possible? Elizabeth, whom 3 days before she had left in Karl's hands, Elizabeth who at this very moment ought to be either dead or a prisoner in a German fortress, the access to which was guarded by more than 2 million German soldiers. Elizabeth was here. She had escaped Karl in less than 3 days. She had fled from Hildensheim Castle and passed through the lines of those 2 million Germans. The Comtesse Hermine sat down with distorted features at the table that served her as a rampart, and in her fury dug her clenched fists into her cheeks. She realized the position. The time was past for jesting or defiance. The time was past for bargaining. In the hideous game which she was playing, the last chance of victory had suddenly slipped from her grasp. She must yield before the conqueror, and that conqueror was Paul Delroze. She stammered, "What do you propose to do? What is your object? To murder me?" He shrugged his shoulders. We are not murderers. You are here to be tried. The penalty which you will suffer will be the sentence passed upon you after a lawful trial, in which you will be able to defend yourself." A shiver ran through her, and she protested. "You have no right to try me. You are not judges." At that moment there was a noise on the stairs. A voice cried, "Eyes front!" and immediately after the door, which had remained ajar, was flung open, admitting 3 officers in their long cloaks. Paul hastened towards them and gave them chairs in that part of the room which the light did not reach. A 4th arrived, who was also received by Paul, and took a seat to one side, a little farther away. Élisabeth and Paul were close together. Paul went back to his place in front and, standing beside the table, said, "There are your judges. I am the prosecutor." And forthwith, without hesitation, as though he had settled beforehand all the counts of the indictment which he was about to deliver, speaking in a tone deliberately free from any trace of anger or hatred, he said, "You were born at Hildensheim Castle, of which your grandfather was the steward. The castle was given to your father after the war of 1870. Your name is really Hermine, Hermine von Hohenzollern. Your father used to boast of that name of Hohenzollern, though he had no right to it, but the extraordinary favor in which he stood with the old emperor prevented anyone from contesting his claim. He served in the campaign of 1870 as a colonel, and distinguished himself by the most outrageous acts of cruelty and rapacity. All the treasures that adorn Hildensheim Castle come from France, and to complete the brazenness of it, each object bears a note giving the place from which it came and the name of the owner from whom it was stolen. In addition, in the hall, there is a marble slab inscribed in letters of gold with the name of all the French villages burnt by order of His Excellency Colonel Count Hohenzollern. The Kaiser has often visited the castle. Each time he passes in front of that marble slab, he salutes. The Countess listened without paying much heed. This story obviously seemed to her of but indifferent importance. She waited until she herself came into question. Paul continued, "You inherited from your father 2 sentiments which dominate your whole existence. One of these is an immoderate love for the Hohenzollern dynasty, with which your father appears to have been connected by the hazard of an imperial, or rather a royal, whim. The other is a fierce and savage hatred for France, which he regretted not to have injured as deeply as he would have liked. Your love for the dynasty you concentrated wholly, as soon as you had achieved womanhood, upon the man who represents it now, so much so that, after entertaining the unlikely hope of ascending the throne, you forgave him everything, even his marriage, even his ingratitude, to devote yourself to him body and soul. Married by him first to an Austrian prince who died a mysterious death, and then to a Russian prince who died an equally mysterious death, you worked solely for the greatness of your idol. At the time when war was declared between England and the Transvaal, you were in the Transvaal. At the time of the Russo-Japanese War, you were in Japan. You were everywhere: at Vienna when the Crown Prince Rudolph was assassinated, at Belgrade when King Alexander and Queen Draga were assassinated. But I will not linger over the part played by you in diplomatic events. It is time that I came to your favorite occupation, the work which for the last 20 years you have carried on against France." An expression of wickedness and almost of happiness distorted the Comtesse Hermine's features. Yes, indeed, that was her favorite occupation. She had devoted all her strength to it and all her perverse intelligence. "And even so," added Paul, "I shall not linger over the gigantic work of preparation and espionage which you directed. I have found one of your accomplices, armed with a dagger bearing your initials, even in a village of the Nord, in a church steeple. All that happened was conceived, organized, and carried out by yourself. The proofs which I collected, your correspondence letters and your own letters, are already in the possession of the court. But what I wish to lay special stress upon is that part of your work which concerns the Château d'Ornequin. It will not take long. A few facts linked together by murders will be enough." There was a further silence. The Countess prepared to listen with a sort of anxious curiosity. Paul went on. "It was in 1894 that you suggested to the Emperor the piercing of a tunnel from Èbrecourt to Corvigny. After the question had been studied by the engineers, it was seen that this work, this colossal work, was not possible and could not be effective unless possession was first obtained of the Château d'Ornequin. As it happened, the owner of the property was in a very bad state of health. It was decided to wait. But as he seemed in no hurry to die, you came to Corvigny. A week later he died. Murder the first." "You lie! You lie!" cried the Countess. "You have no proof. I defy you to produce a proof." Paul, without replying, continued. "The château was put up for sale, and strange to say, without the least advertisement, secretly, so to speak. Now what happened was that the man of business whom you had instructed bungled the matter so badly that the château was declared sold to the Comte d'Andeville, who took up his residence there in the following year with his wife and his 2 children. This led to anger and confusion, and lastly a resolve to start work nevertheless and to begin boring at the site of a little chapel, which at the time stood outside the walls of the park. The Emperor often came to Èbrecourt. One day, on leaving the chapel, he was met and recognized by my father and myself. 2 minutes later you were accosting my father. He was stabbed and killed. I myself received a wound. Murder the second. A month later the Comtesse d'Andeville was seized with a mysterious illness and went down to the south to die." "You lie!" cried the Countess again. "Those are all lies, not a single proof." "A month later," continued Paul, still speaking very calmly, "Monsieur d'Andeville, who had lost his wife, took so great a dislike to Ornequin that he declared never to go back to it. Your plan was carried out at once. Now that the château was free, it became necessary for you to obtain a footing there. How was it done? By buying over the keeper, Jérôme, and his wife. That wretched couple, who certainly had the excuse that they were not Alsatians as they pretended to be, but of Luxembourg birth, accepted the bribe. Thenceforth you were at home, free to come to Ornequin as and when you pleased. By your orders, Jérôme even went to the length of keeping the death of the Comtesse Hermine, the real Comtesse Hermine, a secret. And as you also were a Comtesse Hermine, and as no one knew Madame d'Andeville, who had led a secluded life, everything went off well. Moreover, you continued to multiply your precautions. There was one, among others, that baffled me. A portrait of the Comtesse d'Andeville hung in the boudoir which she used to occupy. You had a portrait painted of yourself, of the same size, so as to fit the frame inscribed with the name of the Countess. And this portrait showed you under the same outward aspect, wearing the same clothes and ornaments. In short, you became what you had striven to appear from the outset, and indeed during the lifetime of Madame d'Andeville, whose dress you were even then beginning to copy. You became the Comtesse Hermine d'Andeville, at least during the period of your visits to Ornequin. There was only one danger, the possibility of Monsieur d'Andeville's unexpected return. To ward this off with certainty, there was but one remedy: murder. You therefore managed to become acquainted with Monsieur d'Andeville, which enabled you to watch his movements and correspond with him. Only something happened on which you had not reckoned. I mean to say that a feeling which was really surprising in a woman like yourself began gradually to attach you to the man whom you had chosen as a victim. I have placed among the exhibits a photograph of yourself which you sent to Monsieur d'Andeville from Berlin. At that time you were hoping to induce him to marry you. But he saw through your schemes, drew back, and broke off the friendship." The Countess had knitted her brows. Her lips were distorted. The lookers-on divined all the humiliation which she had undergone and all the bitterness which she had retained in consequence. At the same time she felt no shame, but rather an increasing surprise at thus seeing her life divulged down to the last detail, and her murderous past dragged from the obscurity in which she believed it buried. "When war was declared," Paul continued, "your work was ripe. Stationed in the Èbrecourt villa, at the entrance to the tunnel, you were ready. my marriage to Elizabeth d'Andeville, my sudden arrival at the château, my amazement at seeing the portrait of the woman who had killed my father, all this was told you by Jérôme and took you a little by surprise. You had hurriedly to lay a trap in which I, in my turn, was nearly assassinated. But the mobilization rid you of my presence. You were able to act. 3 weeks later, Corvigny was bombarded, Ornequin taken, Elizabeth a prisoner of Prince Conrad's. That, for you, was an indescribable period. It meant revenge, and also, thanks to you, it meant the great victory, the accomplishment, or nearly so, of the great dream, the apotheosis of the Hohenzollerns. 2 days more and Paris would be captured. 2 months more and Europe was conquered. The intoxication of it! I know of words which you uttered at that time, and I have read lines written by you which bear witness to an absolute madness, the madness of pride, the madness of boundless power, the madness of cruelty, a barbarous madness, an impossible, superhuman madness. And then suddenly the rude awakening, the Battle of the Marne. Ah, I have seen your letters on this subject too, and I know no finer revenge. A woman of your intelligence was bound to see from the first, as you did see, that it meant the breakdown of every hope and certainty. You wrote that to the Emperor. Yes, you wrote it. I have a copy of your letter. Meanwhile, defense became necessary. The French troops were approaching. Through my brother-in-law, Bernard, you learnt that I was at Corvigny. Would Elizabeth be delivered? Elizabeth, who knew all your secrets? No, she must die. You ordered her to be executed. Everything was made ready. And though she was saved, thanks to Prince Conrad, and though in default of her death you had to content yourself with a mock execution intended to cut short my inquiries, at least she was carried off like a slave. And you had 2 victims for your consolation, Jérôme and Rosalie. Your accomplices, smitten with tearful remorse by Elizabeth's tortures, tried to escape with her. You dreaded their evidence against you. They were shot. Murders the 3rd and 4th. And the next day there were 2 more, 2 soldiers whom you had killed, taking them for Bernard and myself. Murders the 5th and 6th. Thus was the whole drama reconstructed in all its tragic phases, and in accordance with the order of the events and murders. And it was a horrible thing to look upon this woman, guilty of so many crimes, walled in by destiny, trapped in this cellar, face to face with her mortal enemies. And yet how was it that she did not appear to have lost all hope? For such was the case, and Bernard noticed it. "Look at her," he said, going up to Paul. "She has twice already consulted her watch, and one would think that she was expecting a miracle or something more, a direct, inevitable aid which is to arrive at a definite hour. See, her eyes are glancing about. She is listening for something." "Order all the soldiers at the foot of the stairs to come in," Paul answered. "There is no reason why they should not hear what I have still to say." And turning towards the Countess, he said in tones which gradually betrayed more feeling, "We are coming to the last act. All this part of the contest you conducted under the aspect of Major Hermann, which made it easier for you to follow the armies and play your part as chief spy. Hermann, Hermine. The Major Hermann, whom, when necessary, you passed off as your brother, was yourself Comtesse Hermine. And it was you whose conversation I overheard with the sham Laschen, or rather Karl the spy, in the ruins of the lighthouse on the bank of the Isère. And it was you whom I caught and bound in the attic of the ferryman's house. Ah, what a fine stroke you missed that day! Your 3 enemies lay wounded within reach of your hand, and you ran away without seeing them, without making an end of them. And you knew nothing further about us, whereas we knew all about your plans. An appointment for the 10th of January at Èbrecourt, that ill-omened appointment which you made with Karl while telling him of your implacable determination to do away with Elizabeth. And I was there, punctually, on the 10th of January. I looked on at Prince Conrad's supper party, and I was there, after the supper, when you handed Karl the poison. I was there on the driver's seat of the motor car, when you gave Karl your last instructions. I was everywhere, and that same evening Karl died, and the next night I kidnapped Prince Conrad, and the day after, that is to say 2 days ago, holding so important a hostage, and thus compelling the Emperor to treat with me, I dictated conditions of which the first was the immediate release of Elizabeth. The Emperor gave way, and here you see us." In all this speech, a speech which showed the Comtesse Hermine with what implacable energy she had been hunted down, there was one word which overwhelmed her as though it related the most terrible of catastrophes. She stammered, "Dead? You say that Karl is dead?" "Shot down by his mistress at the moment when he was trying to kill me," cried Paul, once again mastered by his hatred. "Shot down like a mad dog. Yes, Karl the spy is dead, and even after his death he remained the traitor that he had been all his life. You were asking for my proofs? I discovered them on Karl's person. It was in his pocket-book that I read the story of your crimes, and found copies of your letters and some of the originals as well. He foresaw that sooner or later, when your work was accomplished, you would sacrifice him to secure your own safety, and he revenged himself in advance. He avenged himself just as Jérôme the keeper and his wife Rosalie revenged themselves when about to be shot by your orders, by revealing to Elizabeth the mysterious part which you played at the Château d'Ornequin. So much for your accomplices. You kill them, but they destroy you. It is no longer I who accuse you. It is they. Your letters and their evidence are in the hands of your judges. What answer have you to make?" Paul was standing almost against her. They were separated at the most by a corner of the table, and he was threatening her with all his anger and all his loathing. She retreated towards the wall, under a row of pegs from which hung skirts and blouses, a whole wardrobe of various disguises. Though surrounded, caught in a trap, confounded by an accumulation of proofs, unmasked and helpless, she maintained an attitude of challenge and defiance. The game did not yet seem lost. She had some trump cards left in her hands, and she said, "I have no answer to make. You speak of a woman who has committed murders, and I am not that woman. It is not a question of proving that the Comtesse Hermine is a spy and a murderess. It is a question of proving that I am the Comtesse Hermine. Who can prove that?" "I can." Sitting apart from the 3 officers whom Paul had mentioned as constituting the court was a 4th, who had listened as silently and impassively as they. He stepped forward. The light of the lamp shone on his face. The countess murmured, "Stéphane d'Andeville! Stéphane!" It was the father of Elizabeth and Bernard. He was very pale, weakened by the wounds which he had received and from which he was only beginning to recover. He embraced his children. Bernard expressed his surprise and delight at seeing him there. "Yes," he said, "I had a message from the commander-in-chief, and I came the moment Paul sent for me. Your husband is a fine fellow, Elizabeth. He told me what had happened when we met a little while ago, and I now see all that he has done to crush that viper." He had taken up his stand opposite the countess, and his hearers felt beforehand the full importance of the words which he was about to speak. For a moment she lowered her head before him, but soon her eyes once more flashed defiance, and she said, "So you too have come to accuse me. What have you to say against me? Lies, I suppose, infamies?" There was a long pause after those words. Then, speaking slowly, he said, "I come in the first place as a witness to give the evidence as to your identity for which you were asking just now. You introduced yourself to me long ago by a name which was not your own, a name under which you succeeded in gaining my confidence. Later, when you tried to bring about a closer relationship between us, you revealed to me who you really were, hoping in this way to dazzle me with your titles and your connections. It is therefore my right and my duty to declare before God and man that you are really and truly the Countess Hermine von Hohenzollern. The documents which you showed me were genuine, and it was just because you were the Countess von Hohenzollern that I broke off relations which in any case were painful and disagreeable to me, for reasons which I should have been puzzled to state. That is my evidence." "It is infamous evidence!" she cried in a fury. Lying evidence, as I said it would be. Not a proof." "Not a proof?" echoed the Comte d'Andeville, moving closer to her and shaking with rage. "What about this photograph signed by yourself which you sent me from Berlin? This photograph in which you had the impudence to dress up like my wife? Yes, you! You did this thing. You thought that by trying to make your picture resemble that of my poor loved one, you would rouse in my breast feelings favourable to yourself. And you did not feel that what you were doing was the worst insult, the worst outrage that you could offer to the dead. And you dared, you, after what had happened." Like Paul Delroze a few minutes before, the Count was standing close against her, threatening her with his hatred. She muttered in a sort of embarrassment, "Well, why not?" He clenched his fists and said, "As you say, why not? I did not know at the time what you were, and I knew nothing of the tragedy of the past. It is only today that I have been able to compare the facts. And whereas I repulsed you at that time with a purely instinctive repulsion, I accuse you now with unparalleled execration. Now, when I know, yes, know with absolute certainty. Long ago, when my poor wife was dying, time after time the doctor said to me, 'It's a strange illness. She has bronchitis and pneumonia, I know. And yet there are things which I don't understand. Symptoms, why conceal it, symptoms of poisoning.' I used to protest. The theory seemed impossible. My wife poisoned? And by whom? By you, Comtesse Hermine, by you. I declare it today. By you, I swear it, as I hope to be saved. Proofs? Why, your whole life bears witness against you." Listen, there is one point on which Paul Delroze failed to shed light. He did not understand why, when you murdered his father, you wore clothes like those of my wife. Why did you? For this hateful reason, that even at that time my wife's death was resolved upon, and that you already wished to create in the minds of those who might see you a confusion between the Comtesse d'Andeville and yourself. The proof is undeniable. My wife stood in your way. You killed her. You guessed that once my wife was dead, I should never come back to Ornequin, and you killed my wife. Paul Delroze, you have spoken of 6 murders. This is the 7th, the murder of the Comtesse d'Andeville." The Count had raised his 2 clenched fists and was shaking them in the Comtesse Hermine's face. He was trembling with rage and seemed on the point of striking her. She, however, remained impassive. She made no attempt to deny this latest accusation. It was as though everything had become indifferent to her, this unexpected charge as well as all those already levelled at her. She appeared to have no thought of impending danger or of the need of replying. Her mind was elsewhere. She was listening to something other than those words, seeing something other than what was before her eyes. And as Bernard had remarked, it was as though she were preoccupied with outside happenings rather than with the terrible position in which she found herself. But why? What was she hoping for? A minute elapsed, and another minute. Then, somewhere in the cellar, in the upper part of it, there was a sound, a sort of click. The Countess drew herself up, and she listened with all her concentrated attention, and with an expression of such eagerness that nobody disturbed the tremendous silence. Paul Delroze and Monsieur d'Andeville had instinctively stepped back to the table, and the Comtesse Hermine went on listening. Suddenly, above her head, in the very thickness of the vaulted ceiling, an electric bell rang, only for a few seconds. 4 peals of equal length, and that was all. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of The Woman of Mystery. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc. Chapter 20. The Death Penalty and a Capital Punishment. The Comtesse Hermine started up triumphantly, and this movement of hers was even more dramatic than the inexplicable vibration of that electric bell. She gave a cry of fierce delight, followed by an outburst of laughter. The whole expression of her face changed. It denoted no more anxiety. No more of that tension indicating a groping and bewildered mind. Nothing but insolence, assurance, scorn, and intense pride. "Fools!" she snarled. "Fools! So you really believed oh, what simpletons you Frenchmen are! That you had me caught like a rat in a trap! Me! Me!" The words rushed forth so volubly, so hurriedly, that her utterance was impeded. She became rigid, closing her eyes for a moment. Then, summoning up a great effort of will, she put out her right arm, pushed aside a chair and uncovered a little mahogany slab with a brass switch, for which she felt with her hand, while her eyes remained turned on Paul, on the Comte d'Andeville, on his son, and on the three officers. And in a dry, cutting voice she rapped out: "What have I to fear from you now? You wish to know if I am the Countess von Hohenzollern? Yes, I am. I don't deny it. I even proclaim the fact. The actions which you in your stupid way call murders, yes, I committed them all. It was my duty to the Emperor, to the Greater Germany. A spy? Not at all. Simply a German woman. And what a German woman does for her country is rightly done. So let us have no more silly phrases, no more babbling about the past. Nothing matters but the present and the future. And I am once more mistress of the present and the future both. Thanks to you, I am resuming the direction of events, and we shall have some amusement. Shall I tell you something? All that has happened here during the past few days was prepared by myself. The bridges carried away by the river were sapped at their foundations by my orders. Why? For the trivial purpose of making you fall back? No doubt that was necessary first. We had to announce a victory. Victory or not, it shall be announced. And it will have its effect, that I promise you. But I wanted something better, and I have succeeded." She stopped and then, leaning her body towards her hearers, continued in a lower voice: "The retreat, the disorder among your troops, the need of opposing our advance and bringing up reinforcements must needs compel your commander-in-chief to come here and take counsel with his generals. For months past I have been lying in wait for him. It was impossible for me to get within reach of him. So what was I to do? Why, of course, as I couldn't go to him, I must make him come to me, and lure him to a place chosen by myself where I had made all my arrangements. Well, he has come. My arrangements are made, and I have only to act. I have only to act. He is here, in a room at the little villa which he occupies whenever he comes to Soissons. He is there, I know it. I was waiting for the signal which one of my men was to give me. You have heard the signal yourselves, so there is no doubt about it. The man whom I want is at this moment deliberating with his generals in a house which I know and which I have had mined. He has with him a general commanding an army, and another general, the commander of an army corps. Both are of the ablest. There are 3 of them, not to speak of their subordinates. And I have only to make a movement, understand what I say, a single movement. I have only to touch this lever to blow them all up, together with the house in which they are. Am I to make that movement?" There was a sharp click. Bernard d'Andeville had cocked his revolver. "We must kill the beast," he cried. Paul rushed at him, shouting: "Hold your tongue! And don't move a finger!" The Countess began laughing again, and her laugh was full of wicked glee. "You're right, Paul Delroze, my man. You take in the situation, you do. However quickly that young booby may fire his bullet at me, I shall always have time to pull the lever. And that's what you don't want, isn't it? That's what these other gentlemen and you want to avoid at all costs, even at the cost of my liberty, eh? For that is how the matter stands, alas. All my fine plan is falling to pieces because I am in your hands. But I alone am worth as much as your 3 great generals, am I not? And I have every right to spare them in order to save myself. So are we agreed? Their lives against mine, and at once. Paul Delroze, I give you 1 minute in which to consult your friends. If in 1 minute, speaking in their name and your own, you do not give me your word of honor that you consider me free and that I shall receive every facility for crossing the Swiss frontier, then hey-ho, up we go, as the children say. Oh, how I've got you, all of you, and the humor of it. Hurry up, friend Delroze, your word. Yes, that's all I ask. Hang it, the word of a French officer. Ha, 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 ha." Her nervous, scornful laugh went on ringing through the dead silence, and it happened gradually that its tone rang less surely, like words that fail to produce the intended effect. It rang false, broke, and suddenly ceased. And she stood in dumb amazement. Paul Delroze had not budged, nor had any of the officers nor any of the soldiers in the room. She shook her fist at them. "You're to hurry, do you hear? You have 1 minute, my French friends, 1 minute and no more." Not a man moved. She counted the seconds in a low voice and announced them aloud by tens. At the 40th second she stopped with an anxious look on her face. Those present were as motionless as before. Then she yielded to a fit of fury. "Why, you must be mad!" she cried. "Don't you understand? Oh, perhaps you don't believe me. Yes, that's it. They don't believe me. They can't imagine that it's possible. Possible? Why, it's your own soldiers who worked for me. Yes, by laying telephone lines between the post office and the villa used for headquarters. My assistants had only to tap the wires, and the thing was done. The mine chamber under the villa was connected with this cellar. Do you believe me now?" Her hoarse, panting voice ceased. Her misgivings, which had become more and more marked, distorted her features. Why did none of these men move? Why did they pay no attention to her orders? Had they taken the incredible resolution to accept whatever happened, rather than show her mercy? "Look here," she said, "you understand me, surely? Or else you have all gone mad. Come, think of it. Your generals, the effect which their death would cause, the tremendous impression of our power which it would give, and the confusion that would follow, the retreat of your troops, the disorganization of your staff. Come, come!" It seemed as if she was trying to convince them, nay, more, as if she was beseeching them to look at things from her point of view and to admit the consequence which she had attributed to her action. For her plan to succeed, it was essential that they should consent to act logically. Otherwise. Suddenly she seemed to recoil against the humiliating sort of supplication to which she had been stooping. Resuming her threatening attitude, she cried, "So much the worse for them! So much the worse for them! It will be you who have condemned them. So you insist upon it? We are quite agreed? And then I suppose you think you've got me. Come, come now, even if you show yourselves pig-headed, the Comtesse Hermine has not said her last word. You don't know the Comtesse Hermine. The Comtesse Hermine never surrenders." She was possessed by a sort of frenzy and was horrible to look at. Twisting and writhing with rage, hideous of face, aged by fully 20 years, she suggested the picture of a devil burning in the flames of hell. She cursed, she blasphemed, she gave vent to a string of oaths. She even laughed at the thought of a catastrophe which her next movement would produce. And she spluttered, "All right, it's you who are the executioners. Oh, what folly! So you will have it so? But they must be mad. Look at them calmly sacrificing their generals, their commander-in-chief, in their stupid obstinacy. Well, so much the worse for them. You have insisted on it. I hold you responsible. A word from you, a single word." She had a last moment of hesitation. With a fierce and unyielding face she stared at those stubborn men who seemed to be obeying an implacable command. Not one of them budged. Then it seemed as if, at the moment of taking the fatal decision, she was overcome with such an outburst of voluptuous wickedness that it made her forget the horror of her own position. She simply said, "May God's will be done and my Emperor gain the victory." Stiffening her body, her eyes staring before her, she touched the switch with her finger. The effect was almost immediate. Through the outer air, through the vaulted roof, the sound of the explosion reached the cellar. The ground seemed to shake as though the vibration had spread through the bowels of the earth. Then came silence. The Comtesse Hermine listened for a few seconds longer. Her face was radiant with joy. She repeated, "So that my Emperor may gain the victory." And suddenly, bringing her arm down to her side, she thrust herself backwards among the skirts and blouses against which she was leaning, and seemed actually to sink into the wall and disappear from sight. A heavy door closed with a bang, and almost at the same moment a shot rang through the cellar. Bernard had fired at the row of clothes, and he was rushing towards the hidden door when Paul collared him and held him where he stood. Bernard struggled in Paul's grasp. "But she's escaping us. Why can't you let me go after her? Look here, surely you remember the Èbrecourt tunnel and the system of electric wires. This is the same thing exactly, and here she is getting away." He could not understand Paul's conduct, and his sister was as indignant as himself. Here was the foul creature who had killed their mother, who had stolen their mother's name and place, and they were allowing her to escape. "Paul," she cried, "Paul, you must go after her. You must make an end of her. Paul, you can't forget all that she has done." Élisabeth did not forget. She remembered the Château d'Ornequin and Prince Conrad's villa, and the evening when she had been compelled to toss down a bumper of champagne, and the bargain enforced upon her, and all the shame and torture to which she had been put. But Paul paid no attention to either the brother or the sister, nor did the officers and soldiers. All observed the same rigidly impassive attitude, seemed unaffected by what was happening. 2 or 3 minutes passed, during which a few words were exchanged in whispers, while not a soul stirred. Broken down and shattered with excitement, Élisabeth wept. Bernard's flesh crept at the sound of his sister's sobs, and he felt as if he were suffering one of those nightmares in which we witness the most horrible sights without having the strength or the power to act. And then something happened which everybody except Bernard and Élisabeth seemed to think quite natural. There was a grating sound behind the row of clothes. The invisible door moved on its hinges. The clothes parted and made way for a human form, which was flung on the ground like a bundle. Bernard d'Andeville uttered an exclamation of delight. Élisabeth looked and laughed through her tears. It was the Comtesse Hermine, bound and gagged. 3 gendarmes entered after her. "We've delivered the goods, sir," one of them jested with a fat, jolly chuckle. "We were beginning to get a bit nervous and to wonder if you'd guessed right and if this was really the way she meant to clear out by. But by Jove, sir, the baggage gave us some work to do. A proper hell cat. She struggled and bit like a badger. And the way she yelled! Oh, the vixen!" And to the soldiers, who were in fits of laughter, "Mates, this bit of game was just what we wanted to finish off our day's hunting. It's a grand bag, and Lieutenant Delroze scented the trail finely. There's a picture for you! A whole gang of Boches in one day. Look out, sir, what are you doing? Mind the beast's fangs." Paul was stooping over the spy. He loosened her gag, which seemed to be hurting her. She at once tried to call out, but succeeded only in uttering stifled and incoherent syllables. Nevertheless, Paul was able to make out a few words, against which he protested. "No," he said, "not even that to console you. The game is lost, and that's the worst punishment of all, isn't it? To die without having done the harm you meant to do, and such harm too." He rose and went up to the group of officers. The 3, having fulfilled their functions as judges, were talking together, and one of them said to Paul, "Well played, Delroze. My best congratulations." "Thank you, sir. I would have prevented this attempt to escape, but I wanted to heap up every possible proof against the woman, and not only to accuse her of the crimes which she has committed, but to show her to you in the act of committing crime." "Aye, and there's nothing half-hearted about the vixen. But for you, Delroze, the villa would have blown up with all my staff and myself into the bargain. But what was the explosion which we heard?" "A condemned building, sir, which had already been demolished by the shells, and which the commandant of the fortress wanted to get rid of. We only had to divert the electric wire which starts from here." "So the whole gang is captured?" "Yes, sir, thanks to the spy whom I had the luck to lay my hands on just now, and who told me what I had to do in order to get in here. He had first revealed the Comtesse Hermine's plan in full detail, together with the names of all his accomplices. It was arranged that the man was to let the Countess know, at 10 o'clock this evening, by means of that electric bell, if you were holding a council in your villa. The notice was given, but by one of our own soldiers, acting under my orders." "Well done, and once more thank you, Delroze." The general stepped into the circle of light. He was tall and powerfully built. His upper lip was covered with a thick white moustache. There was a movement of surprise among those present. Bernard d'Andeville and his sister came forward. The soldiers stood to attention. They had recognized the general commanding in chief. With him were the two generals of whom the Countess had spoken. The gendarmes had pushed the spy against the wall opposite. They untied her legs, but had to support her because her knees were giving way beneath her. And her face expressed unspeakable amazement, even more than terror. With wide-open eyes she stared at the man whom she had meant to kill, the man whom she believed to be dead and who was alive, and who would shortly pronounce the inevitable sentence of death upon her. Paul repeated, "To die without having done the harm you intended to do. That is the really terrible thing, is it not?" The commander-in-chief was alive. The hideous and tremendous plot had failed. He was alive, and so were his officers, and so was every one of the spy's enemies. Paul Delroze, Stéphane d'Andeville, Bernard, Élisabeth, those whom she had pursued with her indefatigable hatred. They were all there. She was about to die, gazing at the vision, so horrible for her, of her enemies reunited and happy. And above all, she was about to die with the thought that everything was lost. Her great dream was shattered to pieces. Her emperor's throne was tottering. The very soul of the Hohenzollerns was departing with the Comtesse Hermine. And all this was plainly visible in her haggard eyes, from which gleams of madness flashed at intervals. The general said to one of those with him, "Have you given the order? Are they shooting the lot?" "Yes, this evening, sir." "Very well, we'll begin with this woman, and at once. Here, where we are." The spy gave a start. With a distortion of all her features she succeeded in shifting her gag, and they heard her beseeching for mercy in a torrent of words and moans. "Let us go," said the commander-in-chief. He felt two burning hands press his own. Élisabeth was leaning towards him and entreating him with tears. Paul introduced his wife. The general said gently, "I see that you feel pity, madame, in spite of all that you have gone through. But you must have no pity, madame. Of course it is the pity which we cannot help feeling for those about to die. But we must have no pity for these people or for members of their race. They have placed themselves beyond the pale of mankind, and we must never forget it. When you are a mother, madame, you will teach your children a feeling to which France was a stranger and which will prove a safeguard in the future: hatred of the Huns." He took her by the arm in a friendly fashion and led her towards the door. "Allow me to see you out. Are you coming, Delroze? You must need rest after such a day's work." They went out. The spy was shrieking, "Mercy! Mercy!" The soldiers were already drawn up in a line against the opposite wall. The Count, Paul and Bernard waited for a moment. She had killed the Comte d'Andeville's wife. She had killed Bernard's mother and Paul's father. She had tortured Élisabeth. And, though their minds were troubled, they felt the great calm which the sense of justice gives. No hatred stirred them. No thought of vengeance excited them. The gendarmes had fastened the spy by the waistband to a nail in the wall to hold her up. They now stood aside. Paul said to her, "One of the soldiers here is a priest, if you need his assistance." But she did not understand. She did not listen. She merely saw what was happening and what was about to happen, and she stammered without ceasing, "Mercy! Mercy! Mercy!" They went out. When they came to the top of the staircase, a word of command reached their ears. "Present!" Lest he should hear more, Paul slammed the inner and outer hall doors behind him. Outside was the open air, the good, pure air with which men love to fill their lungs. Troops were marching along, singing as they went. Paul and Bernard learnt that the battle was over and our positions definitely assured. Here also the Comtesse Hermine had failed. A few days later, at the Château d'Ornequin, Second Lieutenant Bernard d'Andeville, accompanied by 12 men, entered the casemate, well warmed and well ventilated, which served as a prison for Prince Conrad. On the table were some bottles and the remains of an ample repast. The prince lay sleeping on a bed against the wall. Bernard tapped him on the shoulder. "Courage, sir." The Prince sprang up, terrified. "Eh? What's that?" "I said, 'Courage, sir. The hour has come.'" Pale as death, the Prince stammered, "Courage? Courage? I don't understand. Oh, Lord, is it possible?" "Everything is always possible," said Bernard, "and what has to happen always happens, especially calamities." And he suggested, "A glass of rum, sir, to pull you together? A cigarette?" Oh, Lord," the Prince repeated, trembling like a leaf. Mechanically he took the cigarette offered him, but it fell from his lips after the first few puffs. Oh, Lord," he never ceased stammering. And his distress increased when he saw the 12 men waiting with their rifles at rest. He wore the distraught look of the condemned man who beholds the outline of the guillotine in the pale light of the dawn. They had to carry him to the terrace, in front of a strip of broken wall. "Sit down, sir," said Bernard. Even without this invitation the wretched man would have been incapable of standing on his feet. He sank upon a stone. The 12 soldiers took up their position facing him. He bent his head so as not to see, and his whole body jerked like that of a dancing doll when you pull its strings. A moment passed, and Bernard asked in a kind and friendly tone, "Would you rather have it front or back?" The Prince, utterly overwhelmed, did not reply, and Bernard exclaimed, "I'm afraid you're not very well, sir. Come, your Royal Highness must pull yourself together. You have lots of time. Lieutenant Delroze won't be here for another 10 minutes. He was very keen on being present at this, how shall I put it, at this little ceremony. And really he will be disappointed in your appearance. You're green in the face, sir." Still displaying the greatest interest, and as though seeking to divert the Prince's thoughts, he said, "What can I tell you, sir, by way of news? You know that your friend the Comtesse Hermine is dead, I suppose? Ha, ha! That makes you prick up your ears, I see. It's quite true. That good and great woman was executed the other day at Soissons. And upon my word, she cut just as poor a figure as you are doing now, sir. They had to hold her up. And the way she yelled and screamed for mercy! There was no pose about her, no dignity. But I can see that your thoughts are straying. Bother! What can I do to cheer you up? Ah, I have an idea." He took a little paper-bound book from his pocket. "Look here, sir, I'll read to you. Of course a Bible would be more appropriate, only I haven't one on me. And the great thing after all is to help you to forget. And I know nothing better for a German who prides himself on his country and his army than this little book. We'll dip into it together, shall we? It's called German Crimes as Related by German Eyewitnesses. It consists of extracts from the diaries of your fellow countrymen. It is therefore one of those irrefutable documents which earn the respect of German science. I'll open it at random. Here goes. The inhabitants fled from the village. It was a horrible sight. All the houses were plastered with blood, and the faces of the dead were hideous to see. We buried them all at once. There were 60 of them, including a number of old women, some old men, a woman about to become a mother, and 3 children who had pressed themselves against one another and died like that. All the survivors were turned out, and I saw 4 little boys carrying on 2 sticks a cradle with a child of 5 or 6 months in it. The whole village was sacked, and I also saw a mother with 2 babies, and one of them had a great wound in the head and had lost an eye." Bernard stopped to address the Prince. "Interesting reading, is it not, sir?" And he went on. 26 August. The charming village of Puy d'Ossus in the Ardennes has been burnt to the ground, though quite innocent, as it seems to me. They tell me that a cyclist fell from his machine and that the fall made his rifle go off of its own accord, so they fired in his direction. After that they simply threw the male inhabitants into the flames. Here's another bit. 25 August. This was in Belgium. We have shot 300 of the inhabitants of the town. Those who survived the volleys were told off to bury the rest. You should have seen the women's faces." And the reading continued, interrupted by judicious reflections which Bernard emitted in a placid voice, as though he were commenting on an historical work. Prince Conrad, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of fainting. When Paul arrived at the Château d'Ornequin and, alighting from his car, went to the terrace, the sight of the prince and the careful stage setting with the 12 soldiers told him of the rather uncanny little comedy which Bernard was playing. He uttered a reproachful protest. "I say, Bernard!" The young man exclaimed in an innocent voice, "Ah, Paul, so you've come! Quick, His Royal Highness and I were waiting for you. We shall be able to finish off this job at last." He went and stood in front of his men at 10 paces from the prince. "Are you ready, sir? Ah, I see you prefer it front way. Very well, though I can't say that you're very attractive seen from the front. However, oh, but look here, this will never do. Don't bend your legs like that, I beg of you. Hold yourself up, do. And please look pleasant. Now then, keep your eyes on my cap. I'm counting. 1, 2. Look pleasant, can't you?" He had lowered his head and was holding a pocket camera against his chest. Presently he squeezed the bulb, the camera clicked, and Bernard exclaimed, "There, I've got you. Sir, I don't know how to thank you. You have been so kind, so patient." The smile was a little forced, perhaps, like the smile of a man on his way to the gallows, and the eyes were like the eyes of a corpse. Otherwise the expression was quite charming. "1,000 thanks." Paul could not help laughing. Prince Conrad had not fully grasped the joke. However, he felt that the danger was past, and he was now trying to put a good face on things, like a gentleman accustomed to bear any sort of misfortune with dignified contempt. Paul said, "You are free, sir. I have an appointment with one of the Emperor's aides-de-camp on the frontier at 3 o'clock today. He is bringing 20 French prisoners, and I am to hand your Royal Highness over to him in exchange. Pray step into the car." Prince Conrad obviously did not grasp a word of what Paul was saying. The appointment on the frontier, the 20 prisoners and the rest were just so many phrases which failed to make any impression on his bewildered brain. But when he had taken his seat and when the motor car drove slowly round the lawn, he saw something that completed his discomfiture. Élisabeth stood on the grass and made him a smiling courtesy. It was an obvious hallucination. He rubbed his eyes with a flabbergasted air which so clearly indicated what was in his mind that Bernard said, "Make no mistake, sir, it's my sister all right. Yes, Paul Delroze and I thought we had better go and fetch her in Germany. So we turned up your Baedeker, asked for an interview with the Emperor, and it was His Majesty himself who, with his usual good grace— Oh, by the way, sir, you must expect to receive a wigging from the governor. His Majesty is simply furious with you. Such a scandal, you know. Behaving like a rotter, you know. You're in for a bad time, sir." The exchange took place at the hour named. The 20 prisoners were handed over. Paul Delroze took the aide-de-camp aside. "Sir," he said, "you will please tell the Emperor that the Countess Hermine von Hohenzollern made an attempt to assassinate the Commander-in-Chief. She was arrested by me, tried by court-martial, and sentenced, and has been shot by the Commander-in-Chief's orders. I am in possession of a certain number of her papers, especially private letters to which I have no doubt that the Emperor himself attaches the greatest importance. They will be returned to His Majesty on the day when the Château d'Ornequin recovers all its furniture, pictures, and other valuables. I wish you good day, sir." It was over. Paul had won all along the line. He had delivered Élisabeth and revenged his father's death. He had destroyed the head of the German Secret Service and, by insisting on the release of the 20 French prisoners, kept all the promises which he had made to the General Commanding in Chief. He had every right to be proud of his work. On the way back, Bernard asked, "So I shocked you just now?" "You more than shocked me," said Paul, laughing. "You made me feel indignant." "Indignant? Really? Indignant, quotha! Here's a young bounder who tries to take your wife from you, and who's let off with a few days' solitary confinement. Here's one of the leaders of those highwaymen who go about committing murder and pillage, and he goes home free to start pillaging and murdering again. Why, it's absurd. Just think, all those scoundrels who wanted war, emperors and princes and emperors and princes' wives, know nothing of war but its pomp and its tragic beauty, and absolutely nothing of the agony that falls upon humbler people. They suffer morally in the dread of the punishment that awaits them, but not physically, in their flesh and in the flesh of their flesh. The others die, they go on living. And when I have this unparalleled opportunity of getting hold of one of them, when I might take revenge on him and his confederates and shoot him in cold blood as they shoot our sisters and our wives, you think it out of the way that I should put the fear of death into him for just 10 minutes? Why, if I had listened to sound human and logical justice, I ought to have visited him with some trifling torture which he would never have forgotten, such as cutting off one of the ears or the tip of his nose. "You are perfectly right," said Paul. "There, you see, you agree with me. I should have cut off the tip of his nose. What a fool I was not to do it, instead of resting content with giving him a wretched lesson which he will have forgotten by tomorrow. What an ass I am! However, my one consolation is that I have taken a photograph which will constitute a priceless document, the face of a Hohenzollern in the presence of death. Oh, I ask you, did you see his face?" The car was passing through Ornequin village. It was deserted. The Huns had burnt down every house and taken away all the inhabitants, driving them before them like troops of slaves. But they saw, seated amid the ruins, a man in rags. He was an old man. He stared at them foolishly with a madman's eyes. Beside him a child was holding forth its arms. Poor little arms from which the hands were gone. End of chapter 20. End of The Woman of Mystery by Maurice Leblanc.